The earliest Greek accounts of Medusa's origins trace back to the primordial forces that shaped the ancient Mediterranean world, rooted in genealogies that predate the familiar Olympian pantheon. According to Hesiod's Theogony, composed in the 8th century BC, Medusa emerged from a lineage of ancient sea deities whose dominion extended over the mysterious depths and untamed waters that surrounded the Greek world. Her parentage connects her directly to Phorcys and Ceto, two primordial beings whose names evoke the raw, untamed power of the ocean's depths. Phorcys, known as the Old Man of the Sea, represented the ancient pre-Olympian forces that governed maritime realms. His domain encompassed not merely the surface waters familiar to Greek sailors, but the profound depths where light never penetrated and strange creatures dwelled beyond human comprehension. Ancient sources describe him as possessing grey hair and a beard that flowed like seaweed, his form shifting between human and marine characteristics. Ceto, whose name derives from the Greek word for sea monster, embodied the dangerous and unpredictable aspects of oceanic power. She was conceived as both a goddess and a primordial sea creature, representing the fears that ancient mariners harboured about the unknown waters beyond their familiar coastal routes. The union of these two primordial deities produced a remarkable brood of offspring, each representing different aspects of ancient terror and wonder. Among their children were the Graeae, the three grey sisters who shared a single eye and tooth between them, the dragon Ladon who guarded the golden apples of the Hesperides, and most significantly for our narrative, the three Gorgon sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. This genealogy places the Gorgons firmly within the category of chthonic deities, beings associated with the earth, underworld, and primordial forces that existed before the establishment of civilized order. Stheno, whose name means forceful or strong, was the eldest of the three sisters and was characterized by her particularly violent nature. Ancient sources describe her as the most aggressive of the Gorgons, responsible for killing more men than either of her sisters. Her immortal status, shared with Euryale, distinguished her from Medusa and established her as a permanent fixture in the cosmic order. Euryale, the wide-leaping sister, was noted for her loud cries that could be heard across vast distances. Her voice was said to be so piercing that it could shatter stone and drive mortals to madness. Like Stheno, she possessed immortality, ensuring her eternal presence as a force of primordial terror. Medusa, the youngest and only mortal sister, occupied a unique position within this triad. Her name, derived from the Greek word medein, meaning to rule or to protect, suggests a more complex role than simple monster. Early sources present her not as an inherently evil being, but as a powerful protective force whose terrifying appearance served to ward off greater dangers. This protective aspect becomes crucial when examining the religious and cultural significance of Gorgon imagery in archaic Greek society. The religious significance of the Gorgons in early Greek culture extended far beyond their role as mythological monsters. Archaeological evidence from the 7th and 6th centuries BC reveals extensive use of Gorgon imagery in religious contexts, particularly as apotropaic symbols designed to ward off evil influences. The distinctive Gorgon face, known as a gorgoneon, appeared on temple pediments, shields, coins, and household objects throughout the Greek world. These representations typically featured a round face with bulging eyes, protruding tongue, wild hair often depicted as snakes, and prominent fangs. The apotropaic function of Gorgon imagery operated on the principle of sympathetic magic, where the terrifying appearance of the Gorgon was believed to frighten away malevolent spirits, enemies, and misfortune. This protective symbolism explains the prevalence of Gorgonean motifs on military equipment, where they served both practical and spiritual purposes. Warriors believed that bearing the image of Medusa would not only intimidate their enemies, but also invoke divine protection in battle. Archaeological excavations have uncovered numerous examples of Gorgon imagery from the Archaic period. providing concrete evidence of their cultural importance. The Temple of Artemis at Corfu, constructed around 590 Kira, 580 BC, features one of the most spectacular examples of architectural Gorgon imagery. The western pediment displays a massive limestone Gorgonaeon measuring over 9 feet in height, flanked by panthers and surrounded by smaller mythological figures. The scale and prominence of this sculpture demonstrate the central role that Gorgon imagery played in religious architecture. Pottery from this period provides additional insight into the evolution and significance of Gorgon motifs. Black figure pottery from the 6th century BC frequently depicts Gorgons in various contexts, from Perseus's quest to obtain Medusa's head to standalone apotropaic images on drinking vessels and storage jars. The artistic style of these representations shows remarkable consistency across different regions of the Greek world, suggesting a shared understanding of Gorgon iconography and its symbolic meaning. The standardization of Gorgon imagery across diverse Greek communities indicates the deep cultural penetration of these mythological figures. Coins from various city-states, including Athens, Neapolis, and Populonia, featured Gorgonaeon designs that served both as civic symbols and protective talismans. The monetary use of Gorgon imagery demonstrates how these ancient religious symbols became integrated into the daily economic life of Greek communities. Temple decorations from the Archaic period reveal the sophisticated theological thinking that surrounded Gorgon imagery. The placement of Gorgonaeon motifs at temple entrances and on sacred vessels suggests that these symbols served as guardians of sacred space, protecting religious precincts from pollution or hostile influences. This protective function aligns with the broader Greek concept of the sacred as something that required careful maintenance and defense against corrupting forces. The artistic evolution of Gorgon representations during the 7th and 6th centuries BC reflects changing religious and cultural attitudes toward these primordial figures. Early depictions tend to emphasize the monstrous and terrifying aspects of the Gorgons, with exaggerated features and animalistic characteristics. As Greek artistic techniques became more sophisticated, Gorgon imagery began to incorporate more human elements while maintaining its essential apotropaic power. Regional variations in Gorgon imagery provide evidence for local religious traditions and cultural adaptations. Etruscan interpretations of Gorgon motifs, for example, often emphasize different aspects of the mythology while maintaining the essential protective function. These variations demonstrate how the fundamental concept of the Gorgon as a protective force transcended specific cultural boundaries while adapting to local religious needs. The integration of Gorgon imagery into domestic contexts reveals the personal and familial dimensions of this religious symbolism. Household objects bearing Gorgonaeon motifs, including lamps, mirrors, and decorative vessels, indicate that protection from Gorgon imagery extended beyond public and military contexts into private life. Families sought the protective power of these ancient symbols to safeguard their homes and loved ones from various forms of harm. The prevalence of Gorgon motifs in funerary contexts adds another dimension to their religious significance. Grave goods and tomb decorations featuring Gorgonaeon designs suggest beliefs about the protective power of these symbols in death as well as life. The presence of Gorgon imagery in burial contexts indicates sophisticated theological concepts about the continuation of protective power beyond mortal existence. The divine nature of the three Gorgon sisters reveals fundamental distinctions that shape their roles within Greek mythology and religious practice. While Stheno and Euryale possessed immortality, granting them eternal existence among the primordial forces of the cosmos, Medusa's mortality created a unique vulnerability that would ultimately define her mythological significance. This crucial difference in their divine status reflects deeper theological concepts about the relationship between permanent cosmic forces and those elements of the divine realm that could be altered or destroyed through heroic action. Stheno, whose name derives from the Greek word sthenos, meaning strength or might, embodied the relentless, unchanging force of primordial power. Ancient sources consistently describe her as the most murderous of the three sisters, with an insatiable appetite for violence that never diminished across the centuries. Her immortal nature meant that this destructive force remained constant in the world, representing those aspects of divine terror that mortals could never hope to eliminate or overcome through conventional means. The permanence of her threat served as a reminder of the enduring presence of chaotic forces that existed beyond human control or understanding. Euryale, the wide-leaping sister, possessed abilities that distinguished her from both her siblings and other mythological beings. Her capacity for tremendous leaps allowed her to traverse vast distances instantaneously, making her an inescapable pursuer once she had identified a target. Ancient accounts describe her voice as particularly terrifying, capable of producing sounds so piercing and unnatural that they could shatter stone formations and drive listeners to immediate madness. This sonic weapon represented a form of divine power that operated through sound rather than sight, expanding the range of Gorgon abilities beyond the famous petrifying gaze associated primarily with Medusa. The immortality shared by Stheno and Euryale placed them in a category of beings that existed outside the normal cycles of life and death that governed both mortal humans and many lesser supernatural entities. This eternal status meant that their influence on the world remained constant, providing a stable foundation of primordial terror that balanced against the ordered civilization represented by the Olympian gods. Their permanent presence in the cosmic order served essential functions in maintaining the boundaries between civilized and wild spaces, ensuring that certain regions remained forbidden to mortal intrusion. Medusa's mortality created a fundamental asymmetry within the sisterhood that had profound implications for her mythological role. Unlike her immortal sisters, she could be killed, making her the only member of the trio accessible to heroic intervention. This vulnerability did not diminish her power during her lifetime, but rather concentrated it in a way that made her both more dangerous and more significant than her eternal siblings. Her mortality transformed her from a permanent cosmic force into a specific challenge that could be overcome through exceptional courage, divine assistance, and strategic planning. Ancient sources provide detailed descriptions of the Gorgon sisters' physical appearance that emphasize their supernatural nature and terrifying presence. Their bodies combined human and bestial characteristics in ways that violated natural order and created immediate revulsion in viewers. Bronze hands replaced normal human appendages, providing them with weapons that could tear through metal and stone with equal ease. These metallic extremities produced distinctive sounds when the sisters moved, creating an audible warning of their approach that added to their terrifying presence. Golden wings sprouted from their shoulders, enabling flight and marking them as beings that transcended earthly limitations. These wings differed from the feathered appendages typically associated with birds or divine messengers, instead resembling the metallic wings of insects magnified to enormous proportions. The golden coloration reflected light in ways that created disorienting visual effects, making it difficult for observers to track their movements accurately during flight. The wings produced a distinctive buzzing sound during flight that could be heard from considerable distances, serving as an additional element of their terrifying presence. The sisters' faces featured boar-like tusks that protruded from their mouths, creating a predatory appearance that emphasized their dangerous nature. These tusks grew continuously throughout their existence, requiring regular sharpening against stone surfaces to maintain their lethal effectiveness. Ancient accounts describe the tusks as capable of piercing bronze armor and crushing bone with minimal effort, making close combat with the Gorgons virtually impossible for mortal warriors. The tusks also served as tools for feeding, allowing the sisters to consume prey that would be impossible for beings with normal human dentition to process. Perhaps the most distinctive and feared aspect of the Gorgon sisters' appearance was their hair, which consisted entirely of living serpents rather than normal human strands. These serpentine locks moved independently, creating a constantly shifting crown of venomous creatures that added to the sisters' supernatural appearance. The snakes varied in size and species, with some accounts describing vipers, cobras and other deadly serpents intertwined among the larger specimens that formed the bulk of their hair. The serpents remained active and aggressive, striking at anything that came within range and adding an additional layer of danger to any encounter with the Gorgons. The serpentine hair served multiple functions beyond simple intimidation. The snakes provided the sisters with enhanced sensory capabilities, detecting movement and heat signatures that might otherwise escape notice. This additional sensory input made it virtually impossible to approach the Gorgons undetected, as the serpents would alert their hosts to potential threats or prey from considerable distances. The snakes also served as weapons, extending the sisters' reach and providing them with venomous attacks that could incapacitate victims before the famous petrifying gaze took effect. Ancient geographical accounts place the dwelling of the Gorgon sisters in the far western reaches of the known world, beyond the Pillars of Heracles in regions that existed at the very edge of Greek geographical understanding. This location positioned them at the boundary between the civilized Mediterranean world and the unknown territories that lay beyond mortal exploration. The choice of this remote location emphasized their role as guardians of cosmic boundaries and their association with the primordial forces that existed before the establishment of human civilization. The proximity of their dwelling to the land of the Hesperides created a concentration of supernatural guardians in the western extremes of the world. The Hesperides, daughters of Atlas, tended the golden apples that granted immortality, while the dragon Ladon, another child of Phorcys and Ceto, served as their primary guardian. This clustering of protective supernatural beings in the western regions created a barrier that prevented unauthorized access to divine treasures and knowledge that could upset the cosmic order. Early Greek geographical understanding placed these western regions beyond the normal reach of mortal travelers, accessible only through divine intervention or exceptional heroic effort. The Pillars of Heracles marked the absolute limit of safe navigation for ordinary sailors, beyond which lay waters inhabited by sea monsters and supernatural dangers that could destroy entire fleets. The placement of the Gorgon sisters in these remote regions emphasized their role as ultimate guardians, beings whose very presence defined the boundaries of the accessible world. The sisters' dwelling itself was described as a desolate landscape of stone formations that revealed the extent of their petrifying power. Countless statues of men and animals littered the area around their home, created from those who had attempted to approach or challenge the Gorgons throughout the centuries. These stone figures served as both warning and testament to the sisters' deadly abilities, creating a sculpture garden of terror that demonstrated the futility of direct confrontation. The religious and mythological functions of the Gorgon sisters extended far beyond their role as monsters or obstacles for heroes to overcome. They served as essential guardians of sacred spaces, protecting boundaries between the mortal and divine realms that required supernatural enforcement. Their terrifying appearance and deadly abilities made them ideal sentinels for locations that mortals were forbidden to enter, ensuring that certain knowledge, treasures, or divine secrets remained protected from unauthorized access. The sisters' position as boundary guardians reflected ancient Greek concepts about the necessity of maintaining clear distinctions between different levels of existence. The divine realm contained powers and knowledge that could prove catastrophic if accessed by unprepared mortals, requiring guardians capable of enforcing these restrictions through overwhelming force. The Gorgons' combination of immortality, supernatural abilities, and unwavering hostility toward intruders made them perfect candidates for this essential cosmic function. Their role as protectors of sacred boundaries also connected them to broader themes of pollution and purification that permeated Greek religious thought. Unauthorized entry into sacred spaces could contaminate both the intruder and the protected area, requiring supernatural guardians who could prevent such violations through their mere presence. The Gorgons' ability to petrify intruders provided a form of ultimate purification, transforming potential polluters into harmless stone before they could complete their transgression. The transformation of Medusa from a beautiful mortal woman into the snake-haired monster of classical mythology represents one of the most complex and controversial narratives in ancient literature, with significantly different versions emerging across centuries of Greek and Roman storytelling. The evolution of this transformation myth reveals fundamental changes in religious thought, cultural values, and literary sensibilities as ancient Mediterranean civilizations developed their understanding of divine justice, sexual violence, and the relationship between gods and mortals. The earliest Greek sources present a markedly different account of Medusa's transformation than the version that became dominant in Roman literature. Archaic Greek texts, including fragments from poets like Pindar and references in early scholia, suggest that Medusa's monstrous appearance was not the result of a curse or punishment, but rather an inherent characteristic of her divine nature. These early accounts treat her terrifying form as a fundamental aspect of her identity as a primordial sea deity, similar to how other chthonic beings possessed naturally frightening appearances that reflected their cosmic functions. Archaeological evidence from the 7th and 6th centuries BC supports this interpretation, as artistic representations of Medusa from this period show no indication that her monstrous features were acquired through transformation. Pottery paintings, temple sculptures, and metalwork consistently depict her with serpentine hair, bronze hands, and the characteristic Gorgonean face, without any suggestion that these features represented a change from a previous human form. The artistic tradition of the archaic period treated her monstrous appearance as natural and permanent, reflecting theological concepts that emphasize the fundamental otherness of primordial deities. Classical Greek sources from the 5th and 4th centuries BC began to introduce elements of transformation into Medusa's story, though these early versions differed substantially from the later Roman accounts. Writers like Apollodorus and references in tragic fragments suggest that Medusa's transformation occurred as a consequence of divine displeasure, but the specific circumstances and moral implications varied considerably from later interpretations. These classical sources often emphasize themes of hubris and divine retribution, rather than sexual violence and victim blaming that would characterize Roman versions. The most influential transformation narrative emerged from Ovid's Metamorphoses, composed during the early 1st century AD under the Roman Empire. Ovid's account fundamentally altered the nature of Medusa's story by introducing the element of sexual assault and transforming her from a willing participant in transgression to a victim of divine violence. According to Ovid's version, Medusa served as a priestess in Athena's temple, bound by vows of chastity that were essential to her religious duties. Her beauty attracted the attention of Poseidon, who pursued her relentlessly despite her attempts to maintain her sacred obligations. Ovid's narrative describes Poseidon's assault on Medusa within the sacred confines of Athena's temple, an act that violated multiple layers of religious and social taboos. The violation occurred in the most sacred space dedicated to the virgin goddess, contaminating both the physical temple and the religious purity that it represented. Poseidon's divine status made resistance impossible for Medusa, creating a situation where she became the victim of an assault that she could neither prevent nor escape. The location of the attack within Athena's temple added sacrilege to sexual violence, compounding the offence against both mortal and divine order. The Roman context of Ovid's writing significantly influenced his presentation of this narrative, as Roman legal and social concepts regarding sexual violence differed from earlier Greek perspectives. Roman law recognized the concept of rape as a crime against property and family honor, rather than primarily against the individual victim, creating legal frameworks that often blamed victims for failing to prevent their own assault. This cultural background shaped Ovid's portrayal of Medusa's transformation as punishment rather than protection, reflecting Roman attitudes that held women responsible for maintaining their chastity, regardless of circumstances. Athena's response to the desecration of her temple reveals the complex theological implications of divine justice in both Greek and Roman religious thought. Rather than punishing Poseidon, who as her uncle and fellow Olympian deity remained beyond her direct authority, Athena directed her wrath toward Medusa, transforming the priestess into a monster whose very gaze could turn living beings to stone. This punishment served multiple functions within the narrative structure, removing the evidence of temple desecration while creating a being whose terrifying appearance would prevent future violations of sacred space. The theological problems inherent in Athena's punishment of Medusa, rather than Poseidon, reflect broader issues in ancient polytheistic systems regarding divine hierarchy and justice. Olympian deities operated within complex power structures that limited their ability to punish equals or superiors, forcing them to redirect their anger towards more vulnerable targets. Athena's position as a virgin goddess made the violation of her temple particularly offensive to her divine nature, but her inability to challenge Poseidon directly created a situation where justice could only be achieved through proxy punishment. Different interpretations of Athena's motivations emerged in various ancient sources, with some suggesting that the transformation served protective rather than punitive purposes. According to these alternative readings, Athena's curse actually shielded Medusa from future assault by making her appearance so terrifying that no one would dare approach her. This interpretation transforms the punishment into a form of divine protection, albeit one that isolated Medusa from human society and condemned her to a life of solitude and fear. The evolution of Medusa's transformation myth from archaic through classical to Roman periods reflects changing cultural attitudes towards sexuality, divine authority, and moral responsibility. Archaic Greek sources emphasized her role as a primordial force whose terrifying nature served cosmic functions, presenting her monstrous appearance as natural and necessary rather than as punishment for transgression. This early theological framework positioned the Gorgons as essential guardians whose frightening aspects protected sacred boundaries and maintained cosmic order. Classical Greek developments in the transformation narrative began to incorporate themes of divine justice and moral consequence, though these early versions maintained greater ambiguity regarding blame and responsibility. The classical period's emphasis on tragic themes and moral complexity created space for interpretations that recognized the injustice inherent in punishing victims while allowing perpetrators to escape consequences. Tragic fragments and scholia from this period suggest that contemporary audiences understood the problematic nature of divine justice as portrayed in these myths. Roman adaptations of the Medusa transformation story, particularly as presented in Ovid's Metamorphoses, introduced explicit themes of sexual violence while simultaneously reinforcing cultural attitudes that blamed victims for their own assault. The Roman legal and social context shaped these narratives in ways that reflected contemporary attitudes toward women's agency, sexual purity, and divine authority. Ovid's sophisticated literary technique allowed him to present these themes with apparent sympathy for Medusa while reinforcing the cultural assumptions that made her punishment seem inevitable. The controversial nature of Poseidon's assault in Athena's temple extends beyond the immediate narrative to encompass broader questions about divine behaviour and moral authority in ancient literature. Poseidon's actions violated fundamental principles of sacred space, family relationships, and divine cooperation that were essential to maintaining cosmic order. His assault on a priestess within a fellow deity's temple represented a cascade of transgressions that threatened the stability of both divine and mortal realms. Ancient Greek concepts of sacred space emphasized the inviolability of temple precincts, which served as neutral ground where even enemies could seek sanctuary and protection. The violation of this sacred space by a deity who should have respected its sanctity created theological problems that ancient writers struggled to address satisfactorily. Poseidon's status as both Athena's uncle and a major Olympian deity complicated attempts to assign appropriate punishment or consequences for his actions. The family relationship between Poseidon and Athena added additional layers of complexity to the narrative, as their kinship created obligations and limitations that affected their interactions. Ancient Greek society placed enormous emphasis on family loyalty and respect for elder relatives, making direct confrontation between Athena and her uncle problematic regardless of the justice of her cause. These cultural constraints forced the narrative toward indirect forms of justice that ultimately victimized Medusa, rather than addressing Poseidon's transgression directly. Roman religious and legal concepts provided different frameworks for understanding divine justice and sexual violence, though these often proved equally problematic for modern readers. Roman law recognized various forms of sexual assault while maintaining legal structures that prioritize family honor and property rights over individual victim rights. This legal background influenced Roman literary treatments of sexual violence, creating narratives that acknowledged wrongdoing while reinforcing social structures that protected perpetrators at victims' expense. The historical context of Roman literature during the early imperial period also shaped presentations of divine authority and justice, as writers navigated political environments where criticism of authority figures could prove dangerous. Ovid's own experience of exile under Augustus demonstrates the risks associated with literary works that challenged established power structures, creating pressures toward narratives that reinforced rather than questioned existing hierarchies. The theological implications of Athena's punishment extend beyond immediate questions of justice to encompass fundamental issues about the nature of divine authority and moral responsibility in polytheistic systems. Athena's role as goddess of wisdom and justice made her response to temple desecration particularly significant, as her actions established precedents for how divine justice operated in cases involving multiple deities and competing claims of authority. The transformation of Medusa into a monster whose gaze could petrify viewers created a being whose very existence served as a warning about the consequences of violating sacred space. This apotropaic function transformed her from victim into guardian, though at the cost of her humanity and social connections. The theological implications of this transformation suggest complex ancient concepts about the relationship between suffering and sacred power, where victimization could paradoxically create divine authority. Ancient religious thought recognized various forms of divine justice that operated according to different principles and timescales than human legal systems. The punishment of Medusa rather than Poseidon reflects these alternative frameworks, where cosmic balance might be maintained through indirect consequences rather than direct retribution. These theological concepts created narrative possibilities that modern readers often find morally problematic, but that reflected genuine ancient attempts to understand divine behavior and cosmic order. The petrifying gaze of Medusa represents one of the most distinctive and terrifying supernatural abilities documented in ancient Mediterranean literature, with detailed descriptions appearing across centuries of Greek and Roman sources that reveal both the mechanics and cultural significance of this deadly power. Homer's Iliad provides the earliest literary reference to the Gorgon's head, describing it as a fearsome device that adorned Athena's aegis, capable of striking terror into the hearts of warriors and routing entire armies through its mere presence on the battlefield. The Homeric account emphasizes the psychological impact of the Gorgon's visage rather than focusing on petrification, suggesting that early conceptions of this power operated primarily through overwhelming fear rather than physical transformation. The Homeric hymns expand upon this foundational description, providing additional details about the nature of the Gorgon's deadly stare and its effects on both mortals and divine beings. These early sources describe the gaze as possessing an immediate and irreversible quality that transcended normal sensory experience, operating through direct visual contact that bypassed conventional physical processes. The hymns emphasize that the petrifying effect occurred instantaneously upon meeting the Gorgon's eyes, leaving no opportunity for escape or protection once the fatal connection had been established. Hesiod's Theogony contributes crucial details about the scope and limitations of the petrifying gaze, establishing that this power extended to all living creatures rather than affecting only humans. The Hesiodic account describes how birds fell from the sky as stone sculptures when they inadvertently flew within sight of the Gorgons, while marine creatures became fossilized monuments on the ocean floor after encountering the sisters during their travels. This universal effect on living beings positioned the Gorgon's gaze as a fundamental force of nature rather than a targeted weapon, operating according to cosmic principles that governed life and death throughout the natural world. Classical sources from the 5th and 4th centuries BC provide increasingly sophisticated analyses of the petrifying gaze, with writers like Pindar and Aeschylus exploring the theological and philosophical implications of this supernatural power. Pindar's fragmentary references suggest that the gaze operated through a form of divine emanation that transformed the essential nature of living beings, converting the animating principle that distinguished life from death into static mineral form. This transformation affected not merely the physical body but the fundamental life force itself, creating stone figures that retained perfect anatomical detail while completely lacking any spark of consciousness or vitality. Aeschylus introduces psychological dimensions to the petrifying gaze that would influence subsequent literary treatments, describing how victims experienced a moment of absolute terror before the transformation took effect. The Aeschylean fragments suggest that the petrification process involved a brief period of awareness, during which victims understood their fate but remained powerless to prevent it, creating a form of supernatural torture that combined physical transformation with psychological torment. This temporal dimension added complexity to the Gorgon's power, transforming it from a simple death sentence into a more elaborate form of divine punishment. Later classical sources, including works by Apollodorus and references in tragic scholia, provide technical details about the mechanics of the petrifying gaze that reveal ancient attempts to understand this supernatural phenomenon within existing frameworks of natural philosophy. These sources describe the gaze as operating through a form of emanation theory, where the Gorgon's eyes projected invisible forces that could alter the fundamental composition of matter at a distance. This theoretical framework positioned the petrifying power within broader ancient concepts about vision and perception, suggesting that the Gorgons possessed an extreme version of abilities that existed in diminished form throughout the natural world. Hellenistic writers expanded upon classical foundations to create more detailed taxonomies of the petrifying gaze's effects on different types of beings and materials. Sources from this period describe how the transformation affected organic and inorganic materials differently, with living creatures becoming perfect stone replicas, while inanimate objects remained largely unchanged. The selectivity of this effect suggested sophisticated supernatural discrimination that could distinguish between different categories of existence, operating according to principles that transcended simple physical contact or proximity. Roman sources, particularly Ovid's Metamorphoses and Lucan's Pharsalia, provide the most detailed ancient descriptions of the petrification process, offering vivid accounts of how the transformation progressed through victims' bodies and the final appearance of the resulting stone figures. Ovid describes the process beginning with the extremities, as fingers and toes gradually hardened into marble, while victims retained consciousness and mobility in their core bodies. The transformation then proceeded inward, affecting limbs and torso before finally reaching vital organs and the brain, creating a prolonged experience of gradual paralysis and awareness of impending death. The Roman accounts emphasize the preservation of fine anatomical details in the petrified victims, describing how stone figures retained facial expressions, clothing textures, and even individual hair strands with perfect accuracy. This attention to detail served both literary and theological purposes, demonstrating the supernatural precision of the Gorgon's power while creating vivid imagery that enhanced the horror of the transformation process. The detailed preservation also suggested that the petrifying gaze operated through principles that transcended normal death, creating a form of suspended animation that maintained physical form while eliminating all biological function. Symbolic interpretations of the deadly stare emerged early in ancient philosophical and religious discourse, with thinkers recognizing the Gorgon's gaze as a powerful metaphor for various forms of spiritual and psychological transformation. Pre-Socratic philosophers, particularly those concerned with theories of perception and knowledge, used the petrifying gaze as an example of how direct encounter with ultimate reality could overwhelm human consciousness and render normal cognitive processes impossible. This philosophical framework positioned Medusa's power as representing the dangerous consequences of attempting to perceive truths that exceeded human capacity for understanding. Pythagorean philosophical traditions incorporated the Gorgon's gaze into their theories about the relationship between vision and spiritual transformation, suggesting that the petrifying power represented an extreme form of the visual processes that governed all forms of knowledge acquisition. According to these interpretations, ordinary vision involved a form of emanation between observer and observed that created understanding through mutual influence, while the Gorgon's gaze represented a catastrophic intensification of this process that destroyed the observer's capacity for independent existence. Platonic philosophical traditions developed sophisticated interpretations of the petrifying gaze that connected it to broader theories about reality, knowledge, and spiritual development. Platonic commentators suggested that the Gorgon's power represented the fate that awaited those who attempted to perceive the realm of pure forms without adequate philosophical preparation, becoming frozen in contemplation of truths that exceeded their capacity for comprehension. This interpretation transformed the deadly stare from a simple supernatural weapon into a complex allegory about the dangers and requirements of philosophical inquiry. Mystery religion traditions throughout the ancient Mediterranean world incorporated Gorgon imagery and symbolism into their initiation practices and theological frameworks, recognizing the petrifying gaze as representing various forms of spiritual death and rebirth. Dionysiac mysteries used Gorgon masks and imagery to represent the terrifying aspects of divine encounter that initiates must confront before achieving spiritual transformation. The deadly stare symbolized the necessity of ego death and the abandonment of ordinary consciousness that preceded mystical union with divine forces. Orphic religious traditions developed elaborate theological interpretations of the Gorgon's power that connected it to fundamental cosmic principles governing life, death, and spiritual transformation. Orphic texts describe the petrifying gaze as representing the power of divine justice that transforms souls according to their spiritual development and moral status. According to these interpretations, the stone transformation represented a form of purification that prepared souls for subsequent reincarnation or spiritual advancement, rather than simple punishment or destruction. Egyptian mystery traditions that influenced Hellenistic religious thought incorporated Gorgon symbolism into their concepts of spiritual protection and transformation. Egyptian-influenced texts describe the deadly stare as representing the power of divine wisdom that could either destroy unprepared souls or transform properly initiated individuals into beings of higher spiritual status. This dual interpretation recognized the Gorgon's gaze as possessing both destructive and transformative potential, depending on the spiritual condition of those who encountered it. Religious practices throughout the ancient world utilized Gorgon imagery as apotropaic symbols that could channel the protective aspects of the deadly stare while avoiding its destructive potential. Temple decorations, amulets, and ritual objects featuring Gorgonean designs were believed to project a diluted form of the petrifying power that could ward off evil influences without harming legitimate worshippers or visitors. This practical application of Gorgon symbolism demonstrated ancient understanding of the power's dual nature and the possibility of harnessing its protective aspects through appropriate ritual frameworks. The paradox of Medusa's beauty and horror created one of the most complex and enduring themes in ancient art and literature, with artists and writers struggling to represent a being who combined irresistible attractiveness with deadly supernatural power. Early artistic representations from the Archaic period emphasized the monstrous aspects of Medusa's appearance, creating Gorgonean images that prioritized a portropaic function over aesthetic appeal. These early depictions featured exaggerated fangs, bulging eyes, protruding tongues, and wild serpentine hair that left no ambiguity about the figure's dangerous nature. Classical period artistic developments began to incorporate elements of beauty into Gorgon representations, creating increasingly sophisticated attempts to balance attractiveness with terror. Vase paintings from the 5th and 4th centuries BC show Medusa with more human facial features and proportions, though still maintaining the essential elements of serpentine hair and supernatural attributes that marked her divine status. These artistic innovations reflected changing cultural attitudes toward the relationship between beauty and danger, recognizing that the most effective supernatural threats might combine attractive and repulsive elements. Hellenistic artistic traditions pushed the beauty-horror paradox to new levels of sophistication, creating representations of Medusa that emphasized her tragic status as a victim of divine punishment while maintaining her terrifying supernatural power. Sculptures from this period often depicted her with classically beautiful facial features marred by expressions of pain or sorrow, surrounded by serpentine hair that writhed with apparent life. These artistic interpretations reflected Hellenistic literary developments that emphasized psychological complexity and emotional nuance in mythological narratives. Roman artistic representations of Medusa achieved perhaps the most successful balance between beauty and horror, creating images that simultaneously attracted and repelled viewers through careful manipulation of classical aesthetic principles. Roman mosaics, frescoes, and sculptures often depicted Medusa with perfect classical features that conformed to contemporary standards of feminine beauty, while incorporating subtle details that suggested her supernatural nature and deadly power. The serpentine hair in these representations often appeared almost decorative until closer examination revealed its threatening nature. The artistic challenge of representing Medusa's paradoxical nature extended beyond simple visual aesthetics to encompass fundamental questions about the relationship between appearance and reality in supernatural beings. Artists had to develop techniques that could suggest the coexistence of contradictory qualities within a single figure, creating representations that acknowledged both the attractive and terrifying aspects of her nature without diminishing either element. This artistic problem reflected broader cultural tensions about the nature of divine power and its relationship to human understanding. Literary treatments of the beauty-horror paradox in Medusa's appearance provided writers with opportunities to explore complex themes about desire, danger, and the relationship between physical attractiveness and moral character. Classical and Hellenistic authors developed sophisticated narrative techniques that could suggest Medusa's former beauty while emphasizing her current monstrous state, creating tragic figures that evoked both sympathy and terror from audiences. The evolution of artistic representations across different historical periods reveals changing cultural attitudes toward feminine beauty, supernatural power, and the relationship between physical appearance and moral status. Archaic period emphasis on monstrous features reflected religious and cultural frameworks that prioritized apotropaic function over aesthetic appeal, while later developments incorporated increasingly complex psychological and emotional dimensions that reflected sophisticated literary and philosophical influences. Comparative analysis of petrifying deities and monsters in other ancient Mediterranean cultures reveals widespread mythological patterns that suggest common cultural concerns about supernatural vision and its deadly potential. Egyptian mythology includes several deities whose gaze possessed destructive power, including the goddess Sekhmet, whose eyes could bring plague and destruction to enemies of divine order. Sekhmet's leonine appearance and solar associations connected her deadly vision to cosmic forces of judgment and purification, creating parallels with Greek concepts of divine justice and supernatural punishment. The Egyptian god Set possessed eyes that could wither crops and bring disease to those who oppose divine will, representing another form of destructive supernatural vision that operated through direct visual contact. Set's association with chaos and disorder created mythological frameworks that paralleled Greek concepts about primordial forces and their relationship to civilized order. The destructive power of Set's gaze served similar functions to the Gorgon's petrifying stare, protecting divine prerogatives while punishing those who transgressed cosmic boundaries. Mesopotamian mythology includes the demon Lamashtu, whose gaze could bring death to children and pregnant women, representing another form of supernatural vision that operated through direct eye contact. Lamashtu's appearance combined human and animal features in ways that paralleled Gorgon iconography, while her specific targeting of vulnerable populations reflected cultural concerns about protecting family structures and reproductive continuity. The apotropaic imagery used to ward off Lamashtu's influence showed remarkable similarities to Greek Gorgonaion designs and functions. Anatolian religious traditions included various deities and demons whose eyes possessed supernatural power over life and death, creating mythological systems that recognized vision as a primary channel for divine influence on the mortal world. The Hittite storm god possessed eyes that could bring lightning and destruction to enemies, while various demon figures used deadly gazes to enforce supernatural justice and maintain cosmic order. These Anatolian traditions influenced Greek religious thought through cultural contact and exchange, contributing to the development of Gorgon mythology and its associated theological concepts. Phoenician and Canaanite mythological traditions included protective deities whose fierce appearance and supernatural gaze served apotropaic functions similar to those associated with Greek Gorgon imagery. Archaeological evidence from Phoenician sites reveals widespread use of protective face imagery that combined human and animal features in ways that paralleled Gorgonaion designs, suggesting common Mediterranean cultural patterns regarding supernatural protection and visual symbolism. The widespread occurrence of petrifying or deadly gaze motifs across different ancient Mediterranean cultures suggests common psychological and cultural foundations that transcended specific religious and mythological systems. These shared patterns reflect fundamental human concerns about the power of vision, the relationship between appearance and reality, and the need for supernatural protection against cosmic forces that exceeded normal human capacity for resistance or understanding. The political machinations that led to Perseus's impossible quest began with King Polydectes of Seriphos, a ruler whose ambitions extended far beyond the governance of his small Aegean island kingdom. Polydectes had become infatuated with Danae, Perseus's mother, who had arrived on Seriphos years earlier as a castaway with her infant son after being cast adrift by her father Acrisius of Argos. The king's brother Dictys, a humble fisherman, had discovered the pair and provided them with shelter and protection, creating a household arrangement that frustrated Polydectes' romantic pursuits. Danae consistently rejected the king's advances, citing her devotion to Zeus, Perseus' divine father, and her contentment with her modest circumstances under Dictys' protection. As Perseus matured into a formidable young warrior, his presence became an increasingly significant obstacle to Polydectes' matrimonial ambitions. The young hero's fierce loyalty to his mother and his growing reputation for courage and strength made any attempt to force Danae into marriage politically and practically dangerous. Perseus had already demonstrated his willingness to confront authority figures who threatened his family's welfare, creating a situation where Polydectes could not simply override the young man's objections through royal decree or physical intimidation. The king recognized that direct confrontation with Perseus would likely result in his own death or exile, necessitating a more subtle approach to removing this obstacle. Polydectes devised a scheme that exploited the heroic culture's emphasis on honor, reputation, and the completion of seemingly impossible tasks. He announced his intention to marry Hippodamia, daughter of King Oenomaus of Pisa, and declared that all nobles and warriors on Seriphos must contribute wedding gifts appropriate to such a prestigious union. The king specifically demanded horses as gifts, knowing that Perseus, raised in modest circumstances by a fisherman, possessed neither horses nor the wealth necessary to acquire them. This deliberate exclusion created a public situation where Perseus's inability to provide an appropriate gift would result in social humiliation and loss of status within the warrior community. The trap reached its culmination when Perseus, stung by the implied slight to his honour and desperate to prove his worthiness despite his humble circumstances, made a rash boast that he could obtain any gift the king desired, even the head of Medusa herself. Ancient sources suggest that Perseus made this declaration during a public feast where wine and competitive boasting had created an atmosphere conducive to such grandiose claims. Polydectes immediately seized upon this opportunity, formally accepting Perseus's offer and binding him through sacred oaths and public witness to fulfill his promise or face permanent exile and dishonour. The king's political calculation proved remarkably sophisticated, as he had created a scenario where Perseus would either die attempting the impossible task or succeed in obtaining Medusa's head, which Polydectes could then claim for his own use as a powerful protective talisman and symbol of royal authority. Either outcome would remove Perseus as an obstacle to the king's matrimonial plans, while potentially providing Polydectes with supernatural power that would enhance his political position among neighbouring kingdoms. The scheme demonstrated the complex interplay between personal ambition and political strategy that characterized leadership in the ancient Mediterranean world. The divine intervention that made Perseus's quest possible began with Athena's direct involvement, motivated by her complex relationship with Medusa and her role as patron goddess of heroes undertaking seemingly impossible tasks. Athena's appearance to Perseus occurred at the moment of his greatest despair, when the young hero had begun to comprehend the true magnitude of the challenge he had accepted. The goddess manifested in her full divine majesty, her grey eyes blazing with supernatural light and her golden aegis displaying the terrible Gorgonion that would soon be enhanced by the addition of Medusa's actual head. Athena's primary gift to Perseus was her polished bronze shield, a divine artifact that possessed reflective properties far superior to any mortal metalwork. The shield's surface had been crafted by Hephaestus himself, using techniques that combined divine metallurgy with supernatural enchantments to create a mirror-like finish that could reflect images with perfect clarity while remaining unbreakable under any conceivable stress. The goddess explained that this shield would allow Perseus to observe Medusa's reflection without making direct eye contact, providing the only known method for approaching the Gorgon without succumbing to her petrifying gaze. The tactical significance of the mirrored shield extended beyond simple protection to encompass fundamental changes in combat methodology that Perseus would need to master. Fighting while observing an opponent through reflection required the development of entirely new spatial awareness and coordination skills, as the reversed image created disorientation that could prove fatal in combat situations. Athena provided Perseus with intensive training in mirror combat techniques, teaching him how to interpret reflected movements, judge distances accurately, and coordinate his own actions with the reversed visual information provided by the shield's surface. Hermes' arrival followed shortly after Athena's initial contact, bringing additional divine assistance that would prove essential for the quest's completion. The messenger god appeared in his traditional role as Psychopomp, the guide who conducted souls between different realms of existence, emphasizing his function as a facilitator of journeys that transcended normal mortal limitations. Hermes' youthful appearance and quick wit provided a counterpoint to Athena's stern wisdom, creating a divine partnership that addressed both the practical and strategic aspects of Perseus' challenge. The winged sandals provided by Hermes represented one of the most crucial elements of divine assistance, as they granted Perseus the ability to traverse vast distances at supernatural speed while remaining airborne above terrestrial obstacles. These sandals, known as the talaria, possessed golden wings that responded directly to the wearer's will, allowing for precise maneuvering in three-dimensional space that would prove essential when confronting flying opponents. The sandals also provided protection from earthbound dangers, enabling Perseus to travel across regions inhabited by monsters and hostile supernatural beings without risking ground-level encounters. Hermes also provided the adamantine sickle, a harvesting tool that had been used by Kronos to castrate his father Uranus, and possessed the supernatural sharpness necessary to cut through the Gorgon's bronze skin and serpentine hair. The sickle's curved blade had been forged from adamant, a mythical substance harder than diamond and capable of cutting through any material in existence. The weapon's association with primordial divine violence and generational conflict made it particularly appropriate for use against beings like the Gorgons, who represented ancient cosmic forces that predated the current Olympian order. The cap of invisibility, known as the Helm of Hades, represented the third crucial element of divine assistance that would allow Perseus to approach his target undetected. This artifact had been crafted by the Cyclops as a gift for Hades during the Titanomachy, providing the Lord of the Underworld with the ability to move unseen among both mortals and immortals. The cap's power operated through manipulation of light and perception rather than simple physical concealment, rendering the wearer completely undetectable to all forms of supernatural and natural observation. The psychological preparation required for using these divine artifacts proved as challenging as mastering their practical applications. Perseus had to overcome natural human instincts regarding flight, invisibility, and combat while maintaining the mental discipline necessary to coordinate multiple supernatural abilities simultaneously. The training process required him to develop new forms of spatial awareness and tactical thinking that incorporated three-dimensional movement, reversed visual information, and the strategic use of invisibility in combat situations. The quest's initial phase required Perseus to locate the Grey, the three Grey sisters who alone possessed knowledge of the Gorgon's current location in the far western reaches of the world. These ancient beings, daughters of Phorcys and Ceto like their Gorgon sisters, dwelled in a desolate region where twilight reigned eternally, neither fully day nor completely night. The Grey had been born old with grey hair and wrinkled skin, and they shared a single iron tooth among the three of them, passing these organs back and forth as needed for vision and eating. Pemfredo, Enyo, and Deeno represented different aspects of ancient wisdom and prophetic knowledge, their names meaning alarm, horror, and dread, respectively. These sisters possessed the ability to perceive events across vast distances and through different periods of time, making them invaluable sources of information about the location and activities of their Gorgon siblings. Their advanced age and supernatural knowledge came at the cost of physical vulnerability, as their shared eye and tooth created periods of blindness and helplessness that could be exploited by clever antagonists. Perseus's approach to the Grey required careful timing and strategic planning, as he needed to intercept the shared eye during the moment of transfer between sisters. The hero concealed himself using Hades' cap of invisibility, observing the sisters' routine until he identified the optimal moment for intervention. The Graiae's predictable pattern of passing the Iron Tooth created brief windows of opportunity when all three sisters were simultaneously blind and vulnerable to surprise attack. The successful theft of the shared eye occurred during a moment when Penfredo was passing the organ to Ennio, creating a brief instant when neither sister possessed vision, while Dano remained distracted by her own concerns. Perseus snatched the eye from the air between the sisters, immediately gaining leverage that would compel them to provide the information he required. The hero's invisibility prevented the Graiae from determining his identity or location, creating additional psychological pressure that enhanced his negotiating position. The sisters' initial response combined outrage, fear, and desperate attempts to bargain for the return of their shared eye. Without this organ, they faced permanent blindness that would leave them helpless against any threats and unable to fulfill their cosmic functions as guardians of ancient wisdom. Perseus maintained his invisible position while explaining his quest and demanding specific information about the Gorgons' current location, the layout of their dwelling, and any additional details that might prove useful for his mission. The negotiation process revealed the complex relationships between different branches of the primordial divine family, as the Graiae expressed conflicted feelings about providing information that would lead to Medusa's death. While they recognized their obligation to protect family members, they also understood that Medusa's mortality made her death inevitable, and that cooperation with Perseus might actually serve the broader cosmic order. The sisters ultimately agreed to provide the requested information in exchange for the return of their eye, though they demanded additional assurances about Perseus's intentions and methods. The intelligence provided by the Graiae proved invaluable for planning the final approach to the Gorgon's lair, as the sisters possessed detailed knowledge of the terrain, defensive arrangements, and behavioural patterns that would determine the quest's success or failure. They described the location as a rocky island surrounded by treacherous waters, with approaches guarded by the petrified remains of previous challengers who had attempted similar missions. The Gorgons themselves maintained irregular patrol schedules, with periods of sleep that provided the only opportunities for successful infiltration. The strategic elements of Perseus's approach incorporated lessons learned from the Graiae about timing, positioning, and the specific vulnerabilities that might be exploited during the confrontation. The sisters emphasized that Medusa typically slept during the midday hours, when the sun's position created optimal lighting conditions for using the mirrored shield effectively. They also provided crucial information about the physical layout of the Gorgon's dwelling, including the location of Medusa's preferred resting place and the most advantageous approach routes that would minimize the risk of detection by her immortal sisters. The importance of avoiding direct eye contact extended beyond the simple mechanics of the petrifying gaze to encompass broader tactical considerations about positioning, movement, and combat effectiveness. Perseus had to master techniques for maintaining spatial awareness while observing his target exclusively through reflection, developing new forms of combat coordination that relied entirely on reversed visual information. The challenge required him to overcome natural human instincts about visual confirmation and spatial orientation, creating mental disciplines that transcended normal warrior training. The final approach to Medusa's lair required Perseus to coordinate multiple supernatural abilities while maintaining the mental discipline necessary for combat against a being whose very appearance could instantly end his life. Using Hermes' winged sandals, Perseus flew across the desolate waters that surrounded the Gorgon's island home, staying low enough to avoid detection while remaining high enough to observe the terrain through Athena's polished shield. The island itself appeared as a barren landscape of grey stone and twisted rock formations, littered with the petrified remains of warriors, sailors, and creatures who had ventured too close to the sisters' domain over the centuries. The stone figures scattered across the island's surface told a grim story of previous attempts to challenge the Gorgons, with some statues showing warriors frozen in mid-charge with weapons raised, while others depicted men caught in desperate flight, their faces turned back toward their pursuers in expressions of absolute terror. Ships had been transformed into stone monuments along the shoreline, their crews preserved forever at their posts, some still manning oars while others stood at the prow with hands shading their eyes as they peered toward the island's interior. The variety and number of these petrified victims demonstrated the extent of the Gorgons' deadly influence and served as a stark reminder of the fate that awaited any who failed in their mission. Perseus identified the Gorgons' actual dwelling through careful observation of the island's central plateau, where a natural amphitheatre of rock formations provided shelter from ocean winds while offering clear sightlines in all directions. The three sisters had arranged their living space to maximize their defensive advantages, with sleeping areas positioned to provide mutual protection while maintaining visibility over potential approach routes. Stheno and Euryale maintained irregular patrol patterns around the perimeter of their territory, their bronze wings creating distinctive sounds that served as an early warning system against intruders. The hero's timing proved crucial, as he arrived during the midday period when Medusa typically rested, while her immortal sisters continued their vigilant watch. The Grey had emphasized that this represented the only window of opportunity for approaching Medusa without immediately alerting Stheno and Euryale, whose supernatural senses could detect the presence of mortals from considerable distances. Perseus positioned himself on a rocky outcropping that provided an elevated vantage point, while remaining concealed from the sisters' patrol routes, using Hades' cap of invisibility to ensure complete concealment. Observing Medusa through the reflection in Athena's shield presented Perseus with his first direct view of the being who had become the focus of his impossible quest. Even in sleep, Medusa's appearance combined elements of terrible beauty with supernatural horror that challenged the hero's mental preparation and emotional stability. Her face retained the classical proportions and refined features that had once made her renowned for her beauty, but these human characteristics were now framed by writhing serpents that moved independently even during her rest, their scales catching sunlight in patterns that created an almost hypnotic visual effect. The serpentine hair displayed remarkable variety in both size and species, with smaller vipers intertwined among larger pythons and cobras that formed the bulk of her supernatural crown. Some serpents appeared to sleep along with their host, while others remained alert and active, their heads swaying gently as they tested the air for unfamiliar scents or sounds. The constant motion created an ever-shifting silhouette that made it difficult to judge distances accurately, even when observing through the shield's reflected surface. Perseus had to concentrate intensely to distinguish between Medusa's actual position and the visual confusion created by her moving hair. Her bronze hands lay folded across her chest, their metallic surface bearing intricate engravings that appeared to shift and change as light played across them. The hands themselves were larger than normal human proportions, with fingers ending in claws capable of tearing through stone and metal with equal ease. Even in repose, these appendages suggested the immense physical power that complemented Medusa's supernatural abilities, creating a formidable opponent who could not be defeated through conventional combat methods. The golden wings folded against her back created geometric patterns that resembled both insect and bird characteristics, their metallic feathers producing soft, chiming sounds when disturbed by ocean breezes. The wings appeared delicate and beautiful from a distance, but closer observation through the shield revealed their true nature as weapons, capable of generating tremendous force during flight. The wing surfaces bore intricate designs that seemed to incorporate both protective symbols and threatening imagery, creating visual complexity that added to the disorienting effect of observing Medusa's form. Perseus began his approach by descending slowly from his elevated position, using the winged sandals to maintain complete silence while navigating between the scattered stone figures that dotted the landscape. Each petrified victim required careful examination, to ensure safe passage, as some statues retained weapons or posed in positions that created physical obstacles for the approaching hero. The stone warriors served as grim waymarkers, their frozen expressions providing constant reminders of the fate that awaited any mistake in timing or positioning. The hero's coordination of multiple supernatural abilities demanded unprecedented levels of concentration and spatial awareness. He had to maintain his invisible state through the cap of Hades while simultaneously managing controlled flight with the winged sandals, all while observing his target exclusively through the reflected image in Athena's shield. The reversed visual information created constant challenges for judging distances and coordinating movements, requiring Perseus to overcome natural human instincts about spatial orientation and visual confirmation. The final approach required Perseus to position himself directly above Medusa's sleeping form, a maneuver that demanded precise control of the winged sandals while maintaining absolute silence. The hero had to account for wind patterns, the movement of Medusa's serpentine hair, and the patrol schedules of her immortal sisters, all while preparing to execute a single perfect strike with Hermes' adamantine sickle. The slightest miscalculation in timing or positioning would alert the Gorgons to his presence and result in immediate death or petrification. Perseus raised the sickle above his head, its curved blade catching sunlight in brief flashes that he hoped would not attract attention from the patrolling sisters. The weapon's supernatural sharpness made it capable of cutting through Medusa's bronze skin and serpentine hair in a single stroke, but only if the blow landed with perfect accuracy at the junction between her neck and head. The hero had to coordinate this strike while observing his target through reflection, maintaining his invisible state and preparing for immediate escape once the deed was accomplished. The actual beheading occurred with shocking swiftness, as Perseus brought the adamantine sickle down in a single fluid motion that severed Medusa's head from her body before she could awaken or react to his presence. The supernatural blade cut through bronze skin, vertebrae, and serpentine hair with equal ease, creating a clean separation that prevented any possibility of survival or regeneration. Medusa's eyes opened during the final instant of the strike, but her gaze met only empty air as Perseus maintained his position above and behind her head, avoiding direct eye contact even during the moment of death. The immediate aftermath of Medusa's death produced supernatural phenomena that exceeded Perseus's expectations and required rapid adaptation of his escape plans. As her severed head fell away from her body, two beings sprang forth from the spilled blood with such sudden force that they nearly knocked the invisible hero from his aerial position. The first creature to emerge was Pegasus, a magnificent winged horse whose pristine white coat and powerful frame immediately marked him as a being of divine origin and extraordinary capabilities. Pegasus possessed wings that combined the characteristics of both eagle and swan, with feathers that gleamed like polished silver in the sunlight, and a wingspan that exceeded 30 feet from tip to tip. The horse's body displayed perfect muscular definition and proportions that suggested both tremendous speed and enduring strength, while his eyes held an intelligence that transcended normal equine awareness. The moment of his birth, Pegasus demonstrated his supernatural nature by taking immediate flight, his powerful wings creating wind currents that disturbed the surrounding stone figures and announced his presence to the entire island. The second being to emerge from Medusa's blood was Chrysaor, a giant warrior who appeared fully grown and armed, with a golden sword that blazed with inner light. Chrysaor's appearance combined human and divine characteristics, with a physique that exceeded normal mortal proportions and features that suggested both nobility and terrible power. His golden armour appeared to be an extension of his body rather than separate equipment, creating protective coverage that could not be removed or damaged through conventional means. The giant's birth created a thunderous sound that echoed across the island and immediately alerted Stheno and Euryale to the catastrophe that had befallen their sister. The mythological significance of these births from Medusa's blood connected to ancient Greek concepts about the relationship between death and generation, where the destruction of one form of life could produce new beings with different characteristics and purposes. Pegasus represented the transformation of Medusa's earthbound terror into a creature of air and inspiration, whose wings carried him beyond the limitations that had defined his mother's existence. The winged horse's association with poetic inspiration and divine messages transformed him into a positive force that channeled the supernatural power of his Gorgon heritage toward creative rather than destructive ends. Chrysaor's emergence as a fully armed giant warrior suggested the continuation of Medusa's protective functions through a being capable of active defense rather than passive deterrence. The Golden Warrior inherited his mother's role as a guardian of sacred boundaries, but his human form and noble bearing allowed him to interact with mortals and gods in ways that had been impossible for the monstrous Gorgon. His golden sword became a symbol of divine justice that could distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate claims to protected treasures or territories. The birth of these two beings from Medusa's blood also fulfilled ancient prophecies about the consequences of her death, as oracular traditions had long predicted that the Gorgon's destruction would release forces that would reshape the balance between mortal and divine realms. Pegasus's role as the mount of future heroes, particularly Bellerophon in his battle against the Chimera, demonstrated how Medusa's death contributed to the success of subsequent heroic endeavours. The winged horse's assistance to heroes represented a form of posthumous redemption for his mother, whose terrifying power was transformed into aid for those who sought to protect civilization from monstrous threats. Chrysaor's subsequent role as the father of Geryon, the three-bodied giant who would later be defeated by Heracles, created genealogical connections that linked Medusa's death to future heroic cycles. The Golden Warrior's offspring inherited aspects of their grandmother's supernatural nature while serving as challenges that tested the abilities of later heroes. This generational continuation ensured that Medusa's influence on Greek mythology extended far beyond her own death, creating lasting impacts on the cosmic order that governed relationships between heroes, monsters, and divine forces. Perseus's escape from the pursuing immortal sisters required immediate implementation of all his supernatural abilities while carrying Medusa's severed head, whose petrifying power remained active even after death. The hero quickly placed the head in a special bag provided by Athena, designed to contain the deadly gaze while allowing him to access its power when needed. The bag itself possessed protective enchantments that prevented the petrifying effect from affecting its carrier while maintaining the head's supernatural potency for future use. Stheno and Euryale's response to their sister's death combined grief, rage, and supernatural fury that manifested in immediate pursuit of the invisible hero. The immortal sisters possessed tracking abilities that operated independently of normal vision, allowing them to follow Perseus's trail through supernatural senses that detected divine artifacts and heroic presence. Their bronze wings created thunderous sounds as they launched themselves into flight, their voices raised in keening wails that could be heard across vast distances and struck terror into the hearts of any mortals within range. The pursuit took the form of a supernatural chase across the Mediterranean, with Perseus using every advantage provided by his divine equipment to maintain his lead over the vengeful Gorgons. The winged sandals allowed him to achieve speeds that exceeded normal flight, while a cap of invisibility prevented visual tracking that might have allowed the sisters to anticipate his movements. However, Stheno and Euryale's immortal nature gave them unlimited endurance that threatened to overcome Perseus's advantages through sheer persistence. The chase route took Perseus across regions inhabited by various supernatural beings and monsters, many of whom were alerted to the pursuit by the Gorgons' wailing cries and the disturbances created by high-speed flight. Sea monsters rose from ocean depths to observe the spectacle, while sky spirits and wind deities gathered to witness this unprecedented event. The supernatural nature of the pursuit created atmospheric disturbances that affected weather patterns and ocean currents, leaving lasting marks on the regions through which the chase passed. Perseus's eventual escape required strategic use of terrain features and divine assistance that allowed him to break the tracking abilities that enabled the Gorgons to follow his trail. The hero sought refuge in sacred groves and temple precincts where divine protection limited the sisters' ability to pursue, creating temporary sanctuaries that provided opportunities for rest and planning. Athena's continued guidance helped Perseus identify safe routes and timing that maximized his advantages while minimizing exposure to recapture. The symbolic interpretations of Perseus's victory over Medusa resonated throughout Greek cultural and religious thought, representing the triumph of heroic order over primordial chaos in ways that addressed fundamental concerns about civilization's relationship to natural and supernatural forces. The hero's success demonstrated that even the most terrifying aspects of the cosmic order could be overcome through proper preparation, divine assistance, and exceptional courage, providing a model for human engagement with forces that exceeded normal mortal capabilities. The victory represented the subordination of ancient chthonic powers to the newer Olympian order, as Perseus's divine sponsors Athena and Hermes represented the current generation of gods who had displaced earlier primordial deities through superior organization and strategic thinking. Medusa's death symbolized the transformation of raw supernatural terror into controlled divine power that could be channeled toward protective rather than destructive purposes, as demonstrated by the subsequent use of her head as an apotropaic device. The hero's use of reflection rather than direct confrontation provided a metaphor for the intellectual and strategic approaches that characterize classical Greek culture's relationship to dangerous knowledge and supernatural forces. Rather than meeting terror with terror or attempting to overcome supernatural power through brute force, Perseus succeeded through cleverness, preparation, and the strategic use of divine gifts that enhanced rather than replaced human capabilities. This approach reflected Greek cultural values that emphasized intelligence and proper planning over simple courage or physical strength. The transformation of Medusa's head into a protective talisman demonstrated Greek concepts about the potential for converting destructive forces into beneficial ones through proper understanding and application. The Gorgon became one of the most powerful apotropaic symbols in ancient Mediterranean culture, protecting temples, cities, and individuals from various forms of harm while serving as a reminder of the hero's victory over primordial terror. This transformation represented the civilizing process through which dangerous natural forces could be domesticated and channeled toward protective purposes. Perseus's possession of Medusa's severed head transformed him from a desperate young hero into one of the most formidable warriors in the ancient world, wielding a weapon whose power exceeded conventional understanding of combat and supernatural force. The head retained all of its petrifying abilities even after separation from Medusa's body, creating a portable source of divine terror that could instantly neutralize any threat through direct visual contact. The preservation of this power defied normal expectations about death and decay, demonstrating that certain supernatural abilities transcended the physical limitations that governed mortal existence. The practical challenges of carrying such a dangerous artifact required careful management and specialized equipment that protected Perseus while maintaining the head's accessibility for combat situations. Athena's specially crafted bag, woven from materials that existed only in divine realms, provided complete containment of the petrifying gaze while allowing rapid deployment when circumstances demanded immediate action. The bag's interior remained perpetually dark, preventing any accidental activation of the head's power, while its exterior bore protective symbols that warded off attempts by other supernatural beings to steal or corrupt this potent weapon. Perseus's first opportunity to test his new weapon came during his encounter with Atlas. the Titan who supported the heavens on his shoulders in the far western regions of the world. Atlas had been warned by an oracle that a son of Zeus would eventually steal the golden apples from his daughter's garden, leading him to refuse hospitality to all travellers who claimed divine parentage. When Perseus requested shelter and provisions for his journey home, Atlas responded with immediate hostility, using his tremendous size and strength to threaten the hero with the physical violence. The confrontation escalated rapidly, as Atlas attempted to crush Perseus with boulders torn from nearby mountainsides, forcing the hero to reveal Medusa's head in self-defense. The moment Atlas looked directly at the Gorgon's features, his massive form began the familiar transformation from living flesh to solid stone, starting with his extremities and progressing inward toward his vital organs. The Titan's enormous size meant that the petrification process took longer than normal, allowing Perseus to observe the complete transformation as Atlas's body became the Atlas Mountains, his head forming the highest peak while his shoulders and arms created the distinctive ridges that would bear his name throughout history. The creation of the Atlas mountain range through Medusa's power demonstrated the head's ability to affect beings of divine or semi-divine status, proving that its petrifying capabilities operated according to principles that transcended normal limitations of mortality and immortality. Atlas's transformation also revealed that the head's power could create permanent geographical features rather than simple statues, suggesting that the scale and nature of the transformation depended on the target's size, power, and cosmic significance. The mountains created from Atlas's body retained certain characteristics of their origin, displaying unusual mineral compositions and atmospheric phenomena that reflected their supernatural genesis. Perseus's subsequent journey brought him to the coast of Ethiopia, where he encountered Andromeda, chained to coastal rocks as a sacrifice to the sea monster Cetus. The princess had been offered to appease Poseidon's wrath after her mother Cassiopeia boasted that Andromeda's beauty exceeded that of the Nereids, creating divine offence that threatened the entire kingdom with destruction. King Cepheus had consulted the oracle of Ammon, who declared that only the sacrifice of his daughter could save his people from the sea god's vengeance, leading to Andromeda's current predicament. The approaching sea monster represented one of Poseidon's most terrifying servants, a creature whose size and ferocity had terrorized Mediterranean coastlines for centuries. Cetus possessed characteristics of both whale and dragon, with a serpentine body that stretched over 200 feet in length and a head equipped with multiple rows of teeth capable of crushing warships. The monster's hide appeared almost metallic, with scales that deflected conventional weapons, while its eyes glowed with supernatural intelligence that suggested awareness beyond normal animal consciousness. Perseus's aerial combat with Cetus required innovative tactical approaches that combined his divine equipment with strategic use of Medusa's head as both weapon and shield. The hero used his winged sandals to maintain altitude advantage, while harassing the sea monster with hit-and-run attacks, striking at vulnerable points along Cetus's spine and neck, while avoiding the creature's massive jaws and thrashing tail. The monster's aquatic nature allowed it to submerge and resurface unpredictably, creating combat challenges that tested Perseus's ability to coordinate flight, invisibility, and weapon deployment simultaneously. The decisive moment came when Perseus managed to position himself directly above Cetus's head during one of the monster's lunging attacks toward Andromeda's position. Using his invisibility to avoid detection, Perseus revealed Medusa's head at the precise instant when the sea monster's eyes focused upward, creating direct visual contact that triggered immediate petrification. The transformation of such a massive creature created spectacular visual effects as Cetus's body gradually solidified into stone, its final position creating a new reef formation that would serve as a navigation landmark for future generations of sailors. The rescue of Andromeda established Perseus's reputation as a hero, capable of overcoming seemingly impossible odds through strategic thinking and proper use of divine gifts. The princess's gratitude and her father's relief led to immediate marriage negotiations, though these were complicated by Andromeda's previous betrothal to her uncle Phineus. The political implications of this romantic entanglement created tensions that would soon require Perseus to employ Medusa's head in defense of his new bride and her family's honor. Phineus arrived at the wedding celebration with a substantial armed force, claiming prior rights to Andromeda and demanding that Perseus surrender his bride or face the consequences of challenging established political agreements. The confrontation took place in King Cepheus's Great Hall, where wedding guests found themselves caught between competing claims of legitimacy and honor. Phineus's supporters included several hundred warriors who had served him in previous campaigns, creating overwhelming numerical odds against Perseus and his few allies among Cepheus's court. The battle that followed demonstrated Medusa's head's effectiveness against multiple opponents in confined spaces, as Perseus used the weapon's petrifying power to neutralize entire groups of attackers simultaneously. The hero's tactical approach involved strategic positioning that allowed him to reveal the head to maximum numbers of enemies while protecting friendly forces through careful control of sightlines and timing. The confined space of the Great Hall actually worked to Perseus's advantage, as the closely packed warriors could not avoid looking in his direction when he revealed his supernatural weapon. The transformation of Phineus's army created one of the most spectacular displays of the head's power recorded in ancient sources, as nearly 200 warriors became stone statues in various poses of attack and defense. Some figures were caught mid-charge with weapons raised, while others attempted to shield their eyes or flee toward the hall's exits. The detailed preservation of facial expressions and body positions created a permanent monument to the battle, with each statue telling part of the story of Perseus's victory over superior numbers through supernatural means. Phineus himself proved more challenging to defeat, as his awareness of Perseus's weapon allowed him to employ mirrors and reflective surfaces in attempts to use the head's power against its wielder. The uncle's tactical knowledge and combat experience created a prolonged duel that tested Perseus's skill in mirror combat techniques learned during his training with Athena. The final confrontation required Perseus to outmaneuver Phineus's defensive strategies while avoiding the various traps and ambushes that the experienced warrior had prepared throughout the hall. The ultimate defeat of Phineus occurred when Perseus used the polished surface of a ceremonial shield to redirect the head's petrifying gaze, creating a complex series of reflections that allowed him to target his opponent while avoiding direct visual contact himself. Phineus's transformation marked the end of organized resistance to Perseus's marriage, though the political consequences of eliminating an entire rival faction would influence Ethiopian court politics for generations to come. Perseus's journey home to Seriphos provided additional opportunities to employ Medusa's head against various threats and obstacles that blocked his path across the Mediterranean world. Bandits and pirates who attempted to rob the hero found themselves transformed into stone landmarks that served as warnings to future criminals, while hostile supernatural beings learned to avoid regions where Perseus had demonstrated his weapon's power. The head's reputation began to precede its wielder, creating psychological advantages that often resolved conflicts without requiring actual combat. The hero's route home took him across regions where various Mediterranean peoples would later claim descent from his actions, or incorporate his deeds into their own foundational myths. Coastal communities in Libya reported that drops of blood from Medusa's head, spilled during Perseus's flight, had created the first venomous serpents in their region, explaining the dangerous wildlife that characterized certain desert areas. These origin stories connected local geographical features and natural phenomena to the cosmic significance of Perseus's quest, creating cultural narratives that validated community identity through association with heroic deeds. Egyptian priestly traditions incorporated Perseus's victory over Medusa into their theological frameworks, interpreting the hero's success as representing the triumph of solar order over chaotic darkness that threatened cosmic stability. Temple records from this period describe ritual reenactments of Perseus's quest that served both religious and political functions, reinforcing pharaonic authority through association with divine victory over primordial forces. The head's petrifying power was understood as representing the ability of properly consecrated royal authority to transform enemies of order into harmless monuments. Phoenician trading communities spread stories of Perseus's deeds throughout their commercial networks, creating variations that emphasized different aspects of the hero's achievements depending on local cultural values and concerns. Some versions focused on Perseus's strategic thinking and proper use of divine gifts, while others emphasized the importance of maintaining proper relationships with patron deities who could provide essential assistance during times of crisis. The head's power served as a metaphor for the protective benefits that came from maintaining correct religious observances and commercial practices. The eventual return to Seriphos brought Perseus into direct confrontation with King Polydectes, whose original scheme had launched the entire quest, but who now faced a hero armed with supernatural power that exceeded any conventional military force. Polydectes had used Perseus's absence to intensify his pursuit of Danae, eventually resorting to threats and coercion that drove her to seek sanctuary in a temple dedicated to Zeus. The king's violation of sacred asylum and his abuse of royal authority created justification for Perseus to employ extreme measures in defense of his mother's honor and safety. The confrontation took place in Polydectes' throne room, where the king had assembled his court to witness what he expected would be Perseus's admission of failure and subsequent exile from the island. Instead, Perseus arrived carrying proof of his quest's completion, though he kept Medusa's head concealed until the appropriate moment for revelation. The king's initial disbelief and mockery quickly transformed into terror as Perseus began to unwrap his supernatural trophy, creating dramatic tension that emphasized the reversal of power relationships that the quest had accomplished. The petrification of Polydectes and his supporters occurred with the same instantaneous effect that had characterized the head's previous uses, transforming the royal court into a sculpture gallery that preserved the moment of their realization that Perseus had indeed accomplished the impossible task. The king's statue retained his expression of shocked comprehension, creating a permanent monument to the consequences of underestimating heroic determination and divine assistance. The transformation of the entire court eliminated the political structure that had oppressed Danae, while providing Perseus with undisputed control over Seriphos. Ancient beliefs about the continued power of Medusa's severed head extended far beyond its immediate military applications to encompass broader concepts about apotropaic protection and the channeling of divine force through material objects. Religious traditions throughout the Mediterranean world recognized that certain supernatural powers could be preserved and transmitted through physical artifacts, creating sacred objects whose potency derived from their connection to cosmic forces rather than simple craftsmanship or artistic skill. The head's apotropaic properties operated through principles that combined visual intimidation with genuine supernatural protection, creating defensive capabilities that functioned against both natural and supernatural threats. Temple decorations incorporating Gorgonean imagery drew upon diluted versions of the head's power, providing protective benefits that could ward off evil influences without risking the catastrophic effects of direct contact with the actual artifact. These symbolic applications demonstrated ancient understanding of how supernatural power could be channeled and controlled through appropriate ritual frameworks and artistic representation. Military applications of Gorgonean symbolism became widespread throughout Greek armies, with shields, armour, and standards bearing Medusa's image to invoke protective benefits during combat. Soldiers believed that carrying these symbols would provide divine protection, while intimidating enemies who recognized the mythological associations. The psychological impact often proved as valuable as any supernatural benefits, as opponents who understood the symbolism might hesitate or lose confidence when facing warriors who claimed connection to Perseus's legendary victory. The head's influence on Mediterranean religious practices extended to mystery cults and initiation rituals that used Medusa imagery to represent various forms of spiritual transformation and divine encounter. Initiates learned to interpret the Gorgon's terrifying appearance as representing the overwhelming nature of direct divine contact, which could either destroy unprepared souls or transform properly prepared individuals into beings of higher spiritual status. These religious applications transformed the head's deadly power into a symbol of spiritual death and rebirth that transcended simple physical destruction. The presentation of Medusa's severed head to Athena marked a pivotal transformation in Greek religious practice, converting a weapon of individual heroic achievement into a permanent symbol of divine protection that would influence Mediterranean civilization for centuries. Perseus approached the goddess at her temple in Athens, carrying the head in its protective wrapping while accompanied by his new bride Andromeda and his mother Danae, both of whom had witnessed the head's terrible power during their journey from Ethiopia. The hero understood that his possession of such a potent supernatural artifact created responsibilities that extended beyond personal use, requiring divine guidance about its proper disposition and future role in maintaining cosmic order. Athena received the offering with formal ceremony that acknowledged both Perseus's heroic achievement and the head's significance as a relic of primordial divine power. The goddess examined the severed head with particular attention to the preservation of its supernatural properties, noting that the petrifying gaze remained as potent in death as it had been during Medusa's lifetime. The serpentine hair continued to writhe with independent motion, each snake maintaining its venomous nature while contributing to the overall effect of supernatural terror that made direct observation impossible for ordinary mortals. The integration of Medusa's head into Athena's aegis required sophisticated divine craftsmanship that could harness the head's power while preventing accidental harm to the goddess's worshippers and allies. Hephaestus, the divine smith, created a special mounting system that secured the head to the center of the aegis while channeling its petrifying energy through the shield's bronze surface. The mounting incorporated protective barriers that prevented the head's gaze from affecting anyone positioned behind the aegis, while allowing its full power to be directed against enemies and threats to divine order. The aegis itself underwent transformation to accommodate its new central element, with the shield's surface developing additional protective properties that complemented the head's petrifying power. The bronze acquired a mirror-like quality that could reflect hostile magic back toward its source, while the shield's edges gained the ability to generate defensive barriers of supernatural force. These enhancements created a comprehensive protective system that combined physical defense with supernatural deterrence, establishing the aegis as one of the most formidable defensive artifacts in the divine arsenal. Athena's first public display of the enhanced aegis occurred during a conflict between Athens and rival city-states that had formed an alliance to challenge Athenian commercial dominance in the Aegean region. The goddess appeared above the battlefield wearing her complete panoply, with the aegis prominently displayed across her chest and Medusa's head clearly visible at its center. The psychological impact proved immediate and decisive, as enemy forces recognized the implications of facing divine protection enhanced by the Gorgon's legendary power. Many soldiers fled without engaging in combat, while others surrendered rather than risk confrontation with such overwhelming supernatural force. The battlefield demonstration established precedents for the aegis's use in protecting Athenian interests, while serving broader functions of maintaining order and justice throughout the Greek world. Athena's selective deployment of the enhanced aegis sent clear messages about divine approval or disapproval of various political and military actions, creating a form of supernatural diplomacy that influenced decision-making processes across multiple city-states. Rulers learned to consider potential divine reactions when planning military campaigns or political initiatives that might attract Athena's attention. The transformation of Medusa from terrifying monster to protective divine symbol reflected fundamental changes in Greek religious understanding during the classical period, as theological concepts evolved to accommodate more sophisticated relationships between destructive and beneficial supernatural forces. Earlier archaic period religious practices had emphasized the separation between beneficial and harmful divine influences, creating clear distinctions between gods who protected communities and monsters who threatened them. The integration of Medusa's power into Athena's protective apparatus demonstrated more nuanced theological thinking that recognized the potential for transforming dangerous forces into beneficial ones through proper divine management. Athenian religious practices incorporated the enhanced aegis into various ceremonial contexts that emphasized the city's special relationship with divine protection and cosmic order. The Panathenaea festival featured elaborate processions where Athena's statue, equipped with a replica of the Medusa-enhanced aegis, was carried through the city streets while citizens offered prayers for continued protection and prosperity. These ceremonies reinforced community identity while demonstrating Athens' claim to divine favour that distinguished it from rival city-states lacking similar supernatural patronage. Temple rituals developed specific protocols for invoking the aegis's protective power during times of crisis or threat to the community. Priests learned ceremonial techniques for requesting Athena's intervention while properly acknowledging the dangerous nature of the power they sought to invoke. These rituals required extensive purification procedures and protective measures that prevented accidental harm to participants while ensuring that divine assistance would be directed against legitimate threats rather than innocent bystanders. The theological implications of housing Medusa's head within Athena's aegis created complex interpretations about the relationship between justice and terror in divine governance. Religious scholars debated whether the head's presence represented Athena's willingness to employ extreme measures in defense of justice, or symbolized the goddess's ability to control and redirect chaotic forces toward beneficial purposes. These discussions influenced legal and political theory, as Athenian thinkers developed concepts of legitimate authority that incorporated both protective and punitive aspects of divine power. The Gorgonean, as Medusa's head came to be known in artistic and religious contexts, rapidly became one of the most recognizable and widely used motifs in Greek visual culture. Artists developed standardized iconographic conventions for representing the head that balanced its terrifying supernatural nature with aesthetic requirements for architectural and decorative applications. Early classical representations emphasized the monstrous aspects of the Gorgoneon, featuring prominent fangs, bulging eyes, and wild serpentine hair that created immediate visual impact while serving apotropaic functions. Architectural applications of Gorgoneon imagery appeared on temple pediments, where large-scale sculptures served both decorative and protective purposes for sacred buildings. The Temple of Athena at Aegina featured a prominent Gorgoneon on its western pediment, positioned to guard the building's main entrance while demonstrating the temple's connection to divine protection. The sculpture's placement created psychological barriers that reminded visitors of the supernatural forces that protected sacred space, while warning potential desecrators about the consequences of inappropriate behaviour. Coins from various Greek city-states incorporated Gorgonean designs that served multiple functions as civic symbols, protective talismans, and markers of political authority. Athenian tetradrachms featured particularly sophisticated representations that combined artistic excellence with apotropaic effectiveness, creating currency that carried protective power along with economic value. The widespread circulation of these coins spread Gorgonean imagery throughout Mediterranean trade networks, establishing the motif as a recognized symbol of Greek cultural and religious identity. Pottery decorations utilized Gorgonean motifs in various contexts that range from purely decorative applications to functional apotropaic uses on vessels intended for religious ceremonies. Black figure and red figure pottery from the 6th and 5th centuries BC featured increasingly sophisticated artistic interpretations that explored different aspects of the Gorgon's mythological significance. Some vessels depicted narrative scenes from Perseus's quest, while others used standalone Gorgoneon images as protective symbols that would safeguard the contents and users of the pottery. Military equipment incorporated Gorgoneon imagery as both protective symbols and psychological weapons that could intimidate enemies while providing supernatural assistance to their bearers. Shield blazons featuring Medusa's head became particularly popular among elite warriors who sought to associate themselves with Perseus's legendary victory while invoking divine protection during combat. The shield's reflective bronze surfaces created additional visual effects that enhanced the Gorgoneon's psychological impact, as sunlight reflected from the polished metal could create disorienting flashes that confused opponents. Jewelry and personal ornaments featuring Gorgoneon designs provided individuals with portable protective symbols that could ward off various forms of harm, while demonstrating their connection to Greek religious and cultural traditions. Wealthy citizens commissioned elaborate pieces that combined precious metals with detailed artistic representations of Medusa's head, creating luxury items that served both aesthetic and spiritual functions. These personal talismans became particularly popular among women, who appreciated the Gorgoneon's protective properties while recognizing its connection to feminine divine power. The evolution of Gorgoneon imagery from purely monstrous representations towards more humanized depictions reflected changing cultural attitudes toward beauty, terror, and the relationship between physical appearance and spiritual power. Late classical and Hellenistic artists began incorporating elements of conventional feminine beauty into their Gorgoneon designs, creating representations that combined attractive features with supernatural attributes in ways that emphasized the tragic aspects of Medusa's transformation. The artistic challenge of representing both beauty and horror within a single image pushed Greek artists to develop sophisticated techniques for suggesting contradictory qualities through careful manipulation of facial features and expressions. Sculptors learned to create faces that appeared beautiful from certain angles while revealing terrifying aspects when viewed from different perspectives, using the three-dimensional properties of sculpture to create dynamic visual experiences that changed as viewers moved around the artwork. Hellenistic period innovations in Gorgoneon representation emphasized psychological complexity and emotional depth that reflected contemporary literary and philosophical interests in character development and moral ambiguity. Artists created representations that suggested Medusa's awareness of her tragic fate, while maintaining her supernatural power, developing iconographic conventions that could convey both victimization and divine authority within the same artistic composition. These sophisticated representations influenced Roman artistic traditions and contributed to the development of more psychologically complex mythological imagery. The transformation of Medusa's image from monster to beautiful woman with serpentine hair represented broader cultural changes in Greek society's understanding of feminine power and its relationship to beauty and danger. Classical period artistic representations began to emphasize Medusa's human characteristics while retaining the serpentine hair that marked her supernatural status, creating images that suggested the potential for beauty and terror to coexist within the same being. This artistic evolution reflected changing social attitudes toward women's roles and capabilities, as Greek society developed more complex understandings of feminine authority and influence. Late classical artistic innovations introduced elements of pathos and sympathy into Gorgoneon imagery, creating representations that invited viewer empathy while maintaining the figure's apotropaic effectiveness. Artists developed techniques for suggesting Medusa's suffering through subtle facial expressions and body language that conveyed tragic dignity without diminishing her supernatural power. These emotionally complex representations influenced subsequent artistic traditions and contributed to the development of more psychologically sophisticated mythological imagery throughout the Hellenistic period. Roman period adaptations of Gorgoneon imagery reflected imperial cultural values while maintaining connections to Greek religious and artistic traditions. Roman artists created representations that emphasized classical beauty and technical perfection, developing highly refined versions of the Medusa motif that served both decorative and protective functions in domestic and public contexts. These Roman innovations influenced artistic traditions throughout the empire and contributed to the preservation of Gorgonean imagery in European cultural memory. The standardization of Gorgonean imagery across different artistic media and geographical regions demonstrated the motif's effectiveness as a universal symbol of protection and divine power. Artists working in various materials and cultural contexts developed consistent iconographic elements that maintain the symbol's recognition value while allowing for local variations and innovations. This widespread adoption created a shared visual vocabulary that transcended regional boundaries and contributed to the development of common Mediterranean cultural identity. The religious significance of Gorgonean imagery extended beyond simple apotropaic functions to encompass complex theological concepts about the transformation of destructive forces into protective ones through proper divine management. Temple decorations and ritual objects featuring the motif served as reminders of the gods' ability to control chaotic forces while channeling their power toward beneficial purposes. These religious applications reinforced community faith in divine protection while demonstrating the effectiveness of proper ritual observance and moral behaviour. The integration of Medusa's head into Athena's aegis created lasting changes in Greek religious iconography that influenced artistic and theological traditions throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. The combination of wisdom, warfare, and transformed terror within a single divine symbol provided a powerful metaphor for the civilizing process through which dangerous natural forces could be domesticated and channeled toward protective purposes. This theological innovation contributed to the development of more sophisticated understanding of divine authority and its relationship to human civilization, establishing conceptual frameworks that would influence religious thought for centuries to come. The transformation of Medusa's image throughout the ancient world began during the Archaic period, when Greek artists first developed the distinctive visual vocabulary that would define Gorgon imagery for centuries. The earliest representations from the 7th and 6th centuries BC emphasized raw supernatural terror over aesthetic refinement, creating mask-like faces that prioritized apotropaic function above artistic beauty. These primitive Gorgoneon designs featured exaggerated facial elements that immediately conveyed danger and otherworldly power to viewers who encountered them on temple facades, pottery, and military equipment. Archaic period artists working in various media developed standardized iconographic elements that became essential components of Gorgon imagery across the Greek world. The characteristic protruding tongue, often depicted as unnaturally long and serpentine, served both as a symbol of death and as a visual representation of the Gorgon's ability to speak curses or incantations. This feature appeared consistently on pottery from Corinth, Athens, and other major ceramic production centres, suggesting widespread cultural agreement about its symbolic importance. The tongue's exaggerated size and prominent position created immediate visual impacts that enhanced the apotropaic effectiveness of objects bearing Gorgoneon decoration. Wild unkempt hair represented another crucial element of early Gorgon iconography, though the serpentine nature of Medusa's locks often remained implicit rather than explicitly depicted in archaic representations. Artists suggested the supernatural quality of Gorgon hair through flowing, dynamic lines that created impressions of constant movement and barely controlled chaos. Pottery painters developed techniques for rendering hair that appeared to writhe and twist independently of natural wind patterns, using curved brushstrokes and overlapping forms that suggested the presence of living serpents without requiring detailed and anatomical accuracy. The bulging eyes that characterized archaic Gorgonean designs served multiple symbolic and practical functions within the broader context of Greek religious and artistic traditions. These oversized ocular features emphasized the deadly nature of the Gorgon's gaze, while creating focal points that drew viewer attention to the most dangerous aspect of these supernatural beings. Vase painters and sculptors developed conventions for depicting eyes that appeared unnaturally large and prominent, often using contrasting colours or metallic inlays to create visual effects that suggested supernatural luminosity or inner fire. Facial features in archaic Gorgonean imagery consistently emphasise bestial rather than human characteristics, with prominent fangs, flattened noses, and exaggerated jaw structures that suggested predatory animals rather than divine beings with human ancestry. These animalistic elements connected Gorgon imagery to broader Greek concepts about the relationship between civilization and wildness, positioning these figures as representatives of untamed natural forces that existed outside the boundaries of organized human society. The artistic emphasis on non-human features reinforced theological concepts that distinguished primordial deities from the more anthropomorphic Olympian gods who governed classical Greek religion. Regional variations in archaic Gorgonean imagery reflected local artistic traditions and cultural preferences while maintaining essential iconographic elements that ensured universal recognition throughout the Greek world. Corinthian pottery featured Gorgon faces with particularly elaborate decorative elements, including intricate patterns around the eyes and mouth that demonstrated the technical skill of local ceramic workshops. Athenian artists developed distinctive approaches to rendering Gorgon hair and facial expressions that emphasized psychological intensity over purely decorative effects. East Greek workshops in Ionia created versions that incorporated Near Eastern artistic influences, resulting in Gorgonean designs that combined Greek mythological content with foreign aesthetic elements. The transition from archaic to classical artistic styles during the late 6th and early 5th centuries BC brought fundamental changes to Gorgon representation that reflected broader cultural shifts in Greek society's understanding of beauty, divinity, and the relationship between physical appearance and spiritual power. Classical period artists began experimenting with more naturalistic approaches to human anatomy and facial features, creating tension between traditional apotropaic requirements and emerging aesthetic preferences for idealized beauty and harmonious proportions. Early classical innovations in Gorgonean imagery appeared first in high-status artistic contexts, including temple sculpture and luxury metalwork commissioned by wealthy patrons who could afford experimental approaches to traditional religious imagery. The Temple of Athena Aphaia on Aegina, constructed around 490 BC, featured pediment sculptures that included Gorgonean elements, rendered with unprecedented attention to anatomical accuracy and emotional expression. These architectural sculptures demonstrated how traditional apotropaic imagery could be adapted to meet classical period aesthetic standards without losing its essential protective functions. Vase painting from the early 5th century BC shows gradual evolution toward more humanized Gorgon features, with artists reducing the prominence of bestial elements while maintaining essential supernatural characteristics. Red figure pottery from this period depicts Medusa with increasingly human facial proportions, though the serpentine hair and deadly gaze remain clearly indicated through artistic conventions that had been established during the Archaic period. These transitional representations suggest that artists were responding to changing cultural attitudes while respecting established religious traditions that required certain iconographic elements for proper apotropaic function. The High Classical period witnessed dramatic innovations in Gorgonean representation that fundamentally altered the balance between beauty and terror in these traditional images. Artists working during this period developed sophisticated techniques for creating faces that combined classical ideals of feminine beauty with supernatural attributes, producing representations that attracted viewers while simultaneously conveying divine power and potential danger. This artistic achievement required unprecedented technical skill and cultural sensitivity, as artists had to navigate between aesthetic innovation and religious conservatism. Sculptural representations from the High Classical period demonstrate the most successful attempts to reconcile beauty with terror in Gorgoneon imagery. The Medusa Rondinini, a Roman marble copy of a Greek original from around 430 BC, exemplifies the classical solution to this artistic challenge. The sculpture features a face of extraordinary beauty rendered according to contemporary standards of feminine perfection, with regular features, smooth skin, and an expression of tragic dignity that invites viewer sympathy. However, the serpentine hair and slightly parted lips suggest the supernatural nature and deadly power that distinguish this figure from ordinary mortal women. Relief sculpture from classical period buildings shows similar approaches to humanizing Gorgon imagery while preserving its essential protective functions. The Parthenon's metope sculptures include Gorgonean elements that demonstrate how traditional apotropaic symbols could be integrated into architectural contexts, celebrating Athenian cultural achievements and divine patronage. These reliefs feature Gorgon faces that emphasize classical beauty and technical excellence, while maintaining enough supernatural characteristics to ensure recognition and effectiveness as protective symbols. Metalwork from the classical period, including bronze mirrors, jewellery and armour decoration, reveals how luxury craftsmen adapted Gorgonean imagery for elite consumers who demanded both protective benefits and aesthetic refinement. These objects often featured highly detailed representations that showcase technical virtuosity while serving practical, apotropaic functions. Bronze mirrors with Gorgonean handles combined functional utility with supernatural protection, creating objects that enhance personal beauty while warding off malevolent influences that might threaten the user's welfare or appearance. The late classical and early Hellenistic periods brought further innovations in Gorgoneon representation that emphasized psychological complexity and emotional depth over simple terror or beauty. Artists during this period developed techniques for suggesting Medusa's tragic awareness of her fate, creating representations that combined supernatural power with human vulnerability in ways that reflected contemporary literary and philosophical interests in character development and moral ambiguity. Hellenistic innovations in Gorgoneon imagery reflected broader cultural changes that emphasized individual psychology and emotional experience over collective religious observance and civic identity. Artists created increasingly personalized interpretations of traditional mythological figures, developing representations that suggested unique personality traits and individual responses to divine punishment or transformation. These psychological approaches to mythological imagery influenced artistic traditions throughout the Hellenistic world and contributed to the development of more complex visual narratives that could convey multiple layers of meaning within single compositions. Roman adaptation of Greek Gorgoneon imagery began during the Republican period as Roman artists and patrons encountered Greek artistic traditions through military conquest and cultural exchange. Early Roman representations typically copied Greek models with varying degrees of accuracy and understanding, creating versions that maintained essential iconographic elements while reflecting Roman cultural values and aesthetic preferences. Republican period Roman art shows gradual development of distinctive approaches to mythological imagery that combined Greek technical excellence with Roman emphasis on historical narrative and political symbolism. Imperial Roman innovations in Gorgoneon representation reflected the empire's cosmopolitan character and its integration of diverse cultural traditions from throughout the Mediterranean world. Roman artists working during the 1st and 2nd centuries AD developed sophisticated syntheses of Greek mythological content with Egyptian, Near Eastern, and indigenous Italian artistic elements. creating representations that appeal to diverse audiences while maintaining essential protective functions. These imperial period innovations influenced artistic traditions throughout the Roman world and contributed to the preservation of classical mythological imagery in European cultural memory. Roman literary treatments of the Medusa myth, particularly Ovid's influential account in the Metamorphoses, provided new interpretive frameworks that influenced artistic representation throughout the imperial period. Ovid's emphasis on transformation, divine punishment, and the relationship between beauty and monstrosity created narrative context that supported more psychologically complex visual representations. Artists responding to Ovid's literary innovations developed techniques for suggesting temporal progression and emotional development within static visual compositions, creating images that implied the story of Medusa's transformation from beautiful priestess to terrifying monster. Architectural applications of Gorgonean imagery in Roman contexts demonstrated the empire's systematic approach to incorporating protective symbols into public and private buildings. Roman architects developed standardized approaches to placing Gorgonean elements in strategic locations that maximized their apotropaic effectiveness, while contributing to overall decorative schemes that celebrated imperial power and cultural sophistication. These architectural applications created visual environments that combined aesthetic pleasure with supernatural protection, reflecting Roman confidence in their ability to control and direct divine forces toward beneficial purposes. Roman domestic context provided new opportunities for Gorgonean imagery that reflected the empire's emphasis on private luxury and personal protection. Wealthy Roman households incorporated Gorgon motifs into floor mosaics, wall paintings, and decorative objects that served both aesthetic and apotropaic functions within domestic spaces. These private applications often featured more intimate and personalized interpretations of traditional imagery, creating representations that addressed individual concerns about family welfare, personal safety, and household prosperity. The spread of Gorgonean imagery throughout the Roman world occurred through multiple channels that reflected the empire's complex cultural and economic networks. Military conquest brought Roman soldiers and administrators into contact with local artistic traditions that were then modified to incorporate Roman iconographic elements and cultural values. Trade relationships facilitated the exchange of decorated objects and artistic techniques between different regions of the empire, creating hybrid styles that combined local traditions with imperial Roman standards. Greek colonization during the Archaic and Classical periods had established Gorgonean imagery throughout the Mediterranean world centuries before Roman expansion, creating cultural foundations that facilitated later Roman adaptation and development of these traditional motifs. Greek colonies in southern Italy, Sicily, North Africa, and the Black Sea region had introduced local populations to Greek mythological imagery and its associated religious and cultural meanings, establishing artistic traditions that continued to influence regional culture long after political independence had ended. The persistence of Gorgonean imagery in diverse cultural contexts throughout antiquity demonstrates the universal appeal of protective symbols that could transcend specific religious and political boundaries while maintaining essential apotropaic functions. Local populations throughout the Mediterranean world adapted Greek and Roman versions of Gorgon imagery to address their own cultural needs and aesthetic preferences, creating regional variations that preserved essential protective meanings while reflecting local artistic traditions and cultural values. Provincial Roman art from regions such as Gaul, Britain, and the Danubian provinces shows creative adaptation of classical Gorgonean imagery that incorporated indigenous artistic elements and cultural symbols. These provincial interpretations often emphasize different aspects of the traditional imagery, creating representations that addressed local concerns about supernatural protection while demonstrating cultural integration with the broader Roman world. The success of these adaptations contributed to the long-term survival of classical mythological imagery in European cultural traditions that extended far beyond the collapse of Roman political authority. The technical evolution of Gorgonean representation across different artistic media reflects the development of increasingly sophisticated manufacturing techniques and artistic capabilities throughout antiquity. Early archaic pottery painting required relatively simple tools and techniques that limited artistic complexity and detail, while later developments in metalworking, sculpture, and mosaic creation provided opportunities for more elaborate and technically demanding representations. These technological advances enabled artists to create increasingly realistic and emotionally compelling versions of traditional imagery that maintained protective effectiveness while achieving new levels of aesthetic sophistication. The standardization of Gorgonean iconography across vast geographical distances and diverse cultural contexts demonstrates the effectiveness of visual communication systems that could transcend linguistic and cultural barriers while maintaining essential symbolic meanings. Trade networks, military campaigns, and cultural exchange facilitated the spread of standardized iconographic elements that ensured universal recognition of protective symbols throughout the ancient Mediterranean world. This standardization process created shared visual vocabularies that contributed to the development of common cultural identities that transcended local political and ethnic boundaries. The medieval period witnessed a fascinating transformation of Medusa imagery, as Christian Europe grappled with pagan mythological symbols while simultaneously recognizing their enduring cultural power and artistic appeal. During the early medieval centuries, roughly from the 5th to 10th centuries AD, classical mythological imagery largely disappeared from European art as Christian iconography dominated religious and secular decoration. However, Medusa's image proved remarkably resilient, surviving in various forms that reflected medieval attempts to reconcile pagan symbolism with Christian theological frameworks. Byzantine artistic traditions maintained connections to classical antiquity through their preservation of Greek and Roman decorative motifs, including modified versions of Gorgonean imagery that appeared on imperial regalia, architectural decoration, and luxury objects. Byzantine craftsmen adapted traditional Medusa representations to serve Christian symbolic purposes, transforming the Gorgon's terrifying visage into a symbol of divine justice and the defeat of evil forces. Imperial crowns and ceremonial objects featured stylized Gorgonean designs that emphasized the emperor's role as God's representative on earth, capable of confronting and defeating supernatural threats to Christian civilization. Medieval Islamic art in regions that had formerly been part of the Byzantine and Roman empires preserved classical mythological imagery through different cultural filters, creating hybrid representations that combined Greek mythological content with Islamic artistic conventions. Manuscript illuminations and decorative objects from the Islamic world occasionally featured figures that clearly derived from classical Gorgon imagery, though these were typically reinterpreted as jinn or other supernatural beings that fit within Islamic cosmological frameworks. The preservation of these classical elements in Islamic art created important links in the chain of cultural transmission that would eventually facilitate the Renaissance rediscovery of classical mythology. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries marked the beginning of systematic medieval engagement with classical literary and artistic traditions, including renewed interest in mythological narratives and their symbolic meanings. Carolingian manuscripts occasionally featured illustrations derived from classical sources, including simplified versions of Perseus's quest that emphasized the hero's Christian virtues of courage and divine favor. These early medieval interpretations typically stripped away the more complex psychological and theological elements of the original myths, focusing instead on straightforward narratives of good triumphing over evil that aligned with Christian moral frameworks. The 12th century Renaissance brought more sophisticated engagement with classical mythology as medieval scholars gained access to previously unknown ancient texts and developed new interpretative frameworks for understanding pagan literature. Medieval commentators on Ovid's Metamorphoses created elaborate allegorical interpretations of the Medusa myth that transformed Perseus's quest into a Christian allegory about the soul's struggle against sin and temptation. These interpretations typically identified Medusa with pride, lust, or other deadly sins, while Perseus represented the Christian warrior armed with faith and divine grace. Gothic cathedral architecture of the 12th and 13th centuries incorporated elements derived from classical Gorgonean imagery into their complex decorative schemes, though these were typically disguised as demons, gargoyles, or other supernatural figures that served Christian symbolic purposes. The famous gargoyles of Notre Dame de Paris and other Gothic cathedrals often featured faces that combined human and monstrous characteristics in ways that clearly echoed classical Gorgon iconography, while serving the practical function of water drainage and the symbolic function of warding off evil influences from sacred spaces. Medieval manuscript illumination provided crucial venues for preserving and transmitting classical mythological imagery throughout the period when such material was otherwise absent from European artistic production. Illuminated copies of classical texts, particularly Ovid's works, featured miniature paintings that maintained visual connections to ancient artistic traditions while adapting them to medieval aesthetic conventions. The Morgan Library's 14th century manuscript of Ovid's Metamorphoses contains remarkable illustrations of Perseus's encounter with Medusa that demonstrates sophisticated understanding of the classical narrative while reflecting contemporary artistic styles and cultural values. The development of medieval romance literature created new contexts for classical mythological figures, including Medusa, who occasionally appeared as obstacles or challenges in chivalric narratives. Medieval romances typically transformed classical monsters into opponents that tested knights' courage and virtue, creating Christian allegories that used familiar mythological figures to explore contemporary moral and spiritual concerns. These literary adaptations maintained cultural memory of classical mythology while adapting it to serve medieval Christian purposes and values. Renaissance humanism of the 14th and 15th centuries initiated systematic rediscovery and reinterpretation of classical mythology that would fundamentally transform European culture's relationship to ancient Greek and Roman traditions. Humanist scholars developed new approaches to classical texts that emphasized historical understanding and literary appreciation rather than purely allegorical interpretation, creating intellectual frameworks that supported more accurate reconstruction of ancient mythological narratives and their original cultural meanings. Early Renaissance artists began incorporating classical mythological subjects into their work as patrons, and audiences developed new appreciation for ancient cultural achievements and their relevance to contemporary concerns. Donatello's bronze Perseus with the head of Medusa, completed around 1440 to 1450, represents one of the earliest Renaissance attempts to recreate classical sculpture's approach to mythological subjects while demonstrating contemporary artistic innovations and technical capabilities. The sculpture's anatomical accuracy and psychological complexity reflected Renaissance interest in individual character and emotional expression that went beyond medieval symbolic interpretations. The invention of printing during the 15th century facilitated widespread distribution of classical texts and their accompanying illustrations, creating new opportunities for artists and writers to encounter ancient mythological narratives and develop their own interpretations. Printed editions of Ovid's Metamorphoses became particularly influential in spreading knowledge of classical mythology throughout European intellectual circles, providing standardized versions of mythological narratives that could serve as sources for artistic and literary works. Renaissance artistic treatment of the Medusa myth reached new levels of sophistication during the High Renaissance, as artists developed techniques capable of representing the complex psychological and symbolic dimensions of classical mythology. Leonardo da Vinci's lost painting of Medusa's head, described by contemporary sources as terrifyingly realistic, reportedly demonstrated the artist's ability to combine classical subject matter with innovative artistic techniques that created unprecedented emotional impact. Although the original work has not survived, contemporary descriptions suggest that Leonardo successfully balanced beauty and horror in ways that recall the most sophisticated ancient representations. Michelangelo's approach to mythological subjects, including his drawings and sketches related to the Perseus myth, demonstrated Renaissance artists' growing confidence in their ability to match or exceed ancient artistic achievements while developing distinctly contemporary approaches to classical themes. His studies for potential sculptural projects featuring Perseus and Medusa showed deep understanding of classical narrative structure while incorporating Renaissance innovations in anatomical representation and emotional expression. Caravaggio's revolutionary approach to mythological painting during the late Renaissance created new possibilities for representing classical subjects with unprecedented psychological realism and emotional intensity. His painting Medusa, created around 1597 for Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, featured the severed head painted on a ceremonial shield that recreated the appearance of Athena's aegis, while demonstrating the artist's mastery of dramatic lighting and realistic representation. The work's combination of classical subject matter with innovative artistic techniques exemplified Renaissance success in reviving ancient cultural traditions while adapting them to contemporary aesthetic and intellectual standards. The Baroque period of the 17th century brought new dramatic interpretations of classical mythology that emphasized emotional intensity and spectacular visual effects over the Renaissance focus on classical restraint and idealized beauty. Baroque artists created increasingly dynamic representations of mythological narratives that used dramatic lighting, exaggerated gestures, and complex compositions to create powerful emotional responses in viewers who encountered these works in religious and secular contexts. Peter Paul Rubens' paintings featuring Perseus and Medusa demonstrated Baroque mastery of complex narrative composition and dynamic figure representation that brought classical mythology to life with unprecedented energy and visual excitement. His painting Perseus liberating Andromeda, completed around 1620 to 1621, featured the hero displaying Medusa's severed head while rescuing his future bride from the sea monster, creating a complex narrative composition that celebrated heroic virtue, while demonstrating the artist's technical virtuosity and creative imagination. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's sculptural approach to mythological subjects during the Baroque period created three-dimensional narratives that captured specific moments of dramatic action with unprecedented realism and emotional intensity. His marble sculpture Perseus with the head of Medusa, completed around 1804 to 1806 but reflecting earlier Baroque traditions, demonstrated how classical mythological subjects could be adapted to serve contemporary artistic and cultural purposes while maintaining connections to ancient narrative traditions. The neoclassical movement of the 18th and early 19th centuries brought renewed interest in classical mythology as European intellectuals developed new appreciation for ancient Greek and Roman cultural achievements and their relevance to contemporary political and social concerns. Neoclassical artists created works that emphasized classical restraint and idealized beauty while using mythological subjects to explore contemporary themes of heroism, virtue, and political liberty that resonated with Enlightenment values and revolutionary politics. Antonio Canova's marble sculpture Perseus Triumphant, completed between 1797 and 1801, exemplified neoclassical success in recreating the aesthetic and emotional impact of ancient sculpture while addressing contemporary cultural concerns. The work featured Perseus holding Medusa's severed head while displaying the classical contrapposto pose that had been perfected by ancient Greek sculptors, creating a synthesis of ancient artistic techniques with contemporary cultural values that celebrated individual heroism and the triumph of reason over superstition. Jacques-Louis David's paintings featuring classical mythological subjects demonstrated how neoclassical artists could use ancient narratives to address contemporary political concerns while maintaining historical accuracy and artistic excellence. His approach to mythological painting emphasized moral instruction and civic virtue that aligned with Enlightenment educational goals, while creating works of lasting artistic merit that continued to influence European cultural development. The Romantic movement of the late 18th and early 19th centuries brought new psychological interpretations of classical mythology that emphasized individual emotion and subjective experience over collective moral instruction and civic virtue. Romantic artists and writers developed approaches to mythological subjects that explored the psychological dimensions of ancient narratives, while using them to examine contemporary concerns about individual identity, creative expression, and the relationship between civilization and nature. Theodore Géricault's paintings and drawings featuring mythological subjects demonstrated romantic interest in the darker psychological aspects of ancient narratives that had been largely ignored by earlier artistic movements. His sketches related to the Perseus myth emphasized the horrific aspects of Medusa's transformation and death, while exploring the psychological impact of heroic violence on both perpetrators and victims. Eugene Delacroix's approach to mythological painting combined romantic emphasis on emotional intensity with sophisticated understanding of classical narrative structure, creating works that honoured ancient literary traditions while addressing contemporary cultural concerns. His paintings featuring scenes from classical mythology demonstrated how romantic artists could use ancient subjects to explore modern themes of individual psychology and social criticism. Modern psychological interpretation of the Medusa myth began with Sigmund Freud's influential essay Medusa's Head, published posthumously in 1940 but written around 1922, which provided the foundation for subsequent psychoanalytic approaches to classical mythology. Freud interpreted Medusa's petrifying gaze as representing male castration anxiety, arguing that the sight of female genitalia could trigger unconscious fears about masculine identity and sexual power that manifested in the mythological narrative of transformation and death. Freud's analysis connected Medusa's serpentine hair to male anxieties about female sexuality and reproductive power, interpreting the snakes as phallic symbols that simultaneously represented and denied female sexual agency. This psychoanalytic framework influenced subsequent scholarly interpretation of the myth, while providing new theoretical tools for understanding the psychological dimensions of ancient mythological narratives and their continued relevance to modern cultural concerns. Carl Jung's analytical psychology offered alternative interpretations of the Medusa myth that emphasized archetypal patterns and collective unconscious elements rather than individual psychological conflicts. Jungian analysis interpreted Medusa as representing the shadow archetype, the dark aspects of human nature that individuals and societies must confront and integrate to achieve psychological wholeness and spiritual development. Jungian approaches to the Medusa myth emphasize the transformative potential of encountering terrifying aspects of the unconscious, interpreting Perseus's victory not as simple heroic triumph, but a successful integration of shadow elements that enabled psychological growth and spiritual development. This interpretive framework influenced subsequent mythological scholarship, while providing theoretical foundations for therapeutic applications of classical narratives in contemporary psychological practice. Feminist scholarship beginning in the 1970s developed new interpretations of the Medusa myth that challenged traditional heroic narratives while emphasizing themes of female victimization and empowerment that had been largely ignored by earlier scholarship. Feminist scholars argued that traditional interpretations of the myth reflected patriarchal cultural values that celebrated male violence against women while ignoring the injustice of punishing victims for crimes committed against them. Hélène Cixous's influential essay The Laugh of the Medusa, published in 1975, transformed feminist discourse about classical mythology by reclaiming Medusa as a symbol of female creative power and resistance to patriarchal oppression. Cixous argued that women should embrace the aspects of feminine identity that patriarchal culture found threatening, using Medusa's transformation from victim to powerful symbol as a model for female empowerment and creative expression. Contemporary feminist interpretations of the Medusa myth have emphasized themes of sexual violence, victim blaming, and the transformation of trauma into sources of personal and political power. These approaches have influenced artistic and literary works that use the Medusa figure to explore modern concerns about gender-based violence, social justice, and women's struggles for equality and recognition in male-dominated societies. Archaeological discoveries throughout the 19th and 20th centuries provided new evidence about ancient worship practices and symbolic meanings associated with Medusa and other Gorgon figures, contributing to more accurate understanding of these mythological beings' original cultural significance. Excavations at Greek and Roman sites revealed extensive use of Gorgoneon imagery in religious contexts that demonstrated the widespread importance of these protective symbols in ancient Mediterranean societies. The discovery of ancient temples featuring prominent Gorgoneon decorations provided evidence about the religious functions of these symbols that went beyond simple apotropaic uses to encompass complex theological concepts about divine protection and cosmic order. Archaeological evidence from sites such as the Temple of Artemis at Corfu revealed sophisticated integration of Gorgon imagery into architectural programs that celebrated divine power, while protecting sacred spaces from hostile influences. Pottery and metalwork discoveries from archaeological contexts throughout the Mediterranean world demonstrated the widespread distribution of Gorgoneon imagery across diverse cultural and chronological contexts, providing evidence for the universal appeal of these protective symbols and their adaptation to local cultural needs and aesthetic preferences. These archaeological findings contributed to scholarly understanding of cultural exchange and artistic influence that shaped ancient Mediterranean civilization. Recent archaeological work at sites associated with ancient mystery religions has revealed new evidence about the use of Gorgon imagery in initiation rituals and esoteric religious practices that provided alternative interpretations of these mythological figures' spiritual significance. Discoveries at Dionysiac and Orphic cult sites have shown how Gorgoneon symbols were incorporated into religious practices that emphasize spiritual transformation and divine encounter rather than simple protection from hostile forces. Contemporary cultural impact of the Medusa myth extends across multiple domains of modern life, from popular entertainment and commercial branding to political activism and therapeutic practice. The figure of Medusa has become a powerful symbol for various contemporary movements and cultural phenomena that use her image to address modern concerns about power, identity, and social justice. Fashion and luxury goods industries have adopted Medusa imagery as symbols of power and sophistication, with brands like Versace using the Gorgoneon as their corporate logo to suggest glamour, danger, and irresistible appeal. These commercial applications demonstrate the continued cultural power of classical, mythological imagery, while adapting it to serve contemporary marketing and branding purposes that reach global audiences. Popular culture representations of Medusa in films, television, literature, and video games have created new interpretations of the classical myth that address contemporary concerns while maintaining connections to ancient narrative traditions. These modern adaptations often emphasize themes of female empowerment, social justice, and the transformation of victimization into sources of personal strength and political activism. The #MeToo movement and contemporary discussions of sexual violence have embraced Medusa as a symbol of women's anger and resistance to patriarchal oppression, using her transformation from victim to powerful figure as a metaphor for survivors' ability to reclaim agency and demand justice. This political appropriation of the Medusa myth demonstrates the continued relevance of classical mythology to contemporary social and political concerns. Therapeutic applications of the Medusa myth in contemporary psychology and counselling have drawn upon both classical narrative elements and modern psychological theory to create treatment approaches that help individuals process trauma and develop resilience. These therapeutic uses demonstrate how ancient mythological narratives can provide frameworks for understanding and addressing contemporary psychological and social problems. The enduring fascination with Medusa across more than 2 millennia of human cultural development reflects the myth's ability to address fundamental concerns about power, identity, transformation, and justice that transcend specific historical and cultural contexts. From ancient Greek religious practices to contemporary feminist activism, the figure of Medusa has provided a powerful symbol for exploring the complex relationships between beauty and terror, victimization and empowerment, individual trauma and collective healing. Her transformation from ancient monster to modern symbol of resistance demonstrates mythology's capacity to evolve and adapt while maintaining essential symbolic power that continues to resonate with human experience across vastly different historical periods and cultural contexts. The Medusa myth's journey from ancient Greek cosmogony through medieval Christianity, Renaissance humanism, and modern psychological interpretation to contemporary political activism illustrates the dynamic nature of mythological narratives and their ability to serve changing cultural needs while preserving essential insights about human nature and social organization that remain relevant across time and cultural boundaries.